Okay, I guess it looks like it's live. Today we're doing a debate on it's on Kevin's channel, but I'm going to be moderating it. It's the debate question is has liberalism failed? Something along those lines. I don't remember exactly how we put it, but basically that has liberalism failed? And saying that it has. Oh gosh, I'm getting an echo. Oh, I've got the one sec. There we go. Okay. So yeah, basically, Ray is going to say yes, it has failed, and this is Ray Murasame. You can see their names. You know who Kevin is, obviously. Ray's going to say that yes, it has. Kevin's saying no, it hasn't, and they're going to have 3 minutes opening statements and I think closing statements too. The rest is just going to be an open conversation. So without delaying anymore, I guess Ray, you can go ahead and start if you would like.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, of course. And yeah, I think that I've been allowed to start this one because I'm the one making the claim. So it's not because of any other reason. So I don't know whether my opening statement will take up the full 3 minutes, but of course, if it does not, I'll just yield the rest of my time, as I do. So I'm going to try not to pack my actual argument into the opening statement because I know how annoying that can actually be when you've stacked up a whole bunch of points in your opening statement and then the other person has to be writing them all down, because I'm assuming that the clash will happen afterwards, so I don't need to actually do that. Right. So with a condensed introduction, the title is, has liberalism failed? I think perhaps the title should have been in the present continuous tense, since the failure we're talking about is kind of like an ongoing failure and is likely to continue going on for a while. And of course, failed at what? In this case, would be a failure to provide stability and development for developing countries. And even now, during this global pandemic, to provide basic law enforcement and public health services to citizens. Right. So before I start, I should, of course, acknowledge that liberalism is not a unified ideology, because I know there's going to be someone out there who's asking, how can we be talking about liberalism without even making an attempt to define what it is? So I'll just give a very quick attempt. There are very many variants of it, some of which hold principles that contradict each other. Some of these variants even have principles that are deliberately placed in tension with each other. So I'm sure there are people out there who, for example, know about fusionism, which is where you deliberately place in tension, different elements of society and different thought processes. But again, there are enough common points among the different liberal tendencies that it is possible to define liberalism as a school of thought despite this. On the one hand, liberalism is an economic doctrine that tends to make the model of self-regulating market a paradigm for all of social reality. So on the other hand, it means that you end up with political liberalism being one way of applying the principles that you've derived from these economic doctrines to every sphere of political life. So I'm assuming that everyone should agree that that is pretty much, that is something that all schools of liberal thought share in common. Liberalism, of course, has an important role in world history. So when I'm making this argument, I'm not saying that liberalism should never have existed, because that would be a ridiculous point to make. It is, after all, a system that came to ascendancy during the first industrial revolution. It was instrumental in ushering in one of the most rapid expansions of wealth in human history. It provided a scaffolding for the organization of several newly emergent nations, most notable among them being, of course, the Italian unification and, to some extent, the German unification. But my argument is that just because something was of great utility previously does not mean that it should be beyond criticism or that it should be seen as relevant in all times and places forever. One of the biggest problems that Western liberalism now has is that its proponents are unwilling to accept that the problems of developing nations often require solutions that are outside the toolset that liberalism has on offer. Whenever you're looking to build a foreign policy platform, you have to guard against viewing the world exclusively through your own prism. You should not rely exclusively on American or even Western lenses in assessing foreign policy challenges. This should be something that is obvious, but liberalism has made an injunction against even thinking outside their own prism. Large parts of the world do not share all of liberal ideals and values, and could never do so, because they simply do not have the same history or the same set of accumulated political experience from the past on which you could build something that could be recognizable as liberal democracy. Their perceptions and behaviors are driven by motivations and experiences that are sometimes very different from your own. But over the past few decades, liberal policymakers have unfortunately proven time and again that they're simply incapable of accepting this. Instead, all we ever see is just mirror imaging. You can't run a foreign policy on mirror imaging, because it just leads to a ridiculous view of the world where anyone who differs from you on anything, and that's going to be a lot of people in a lot of places, it just gets reduced to a kind of cartoonish villain who hates freedom or is racist or is somehow ending up being placed on your list of places that has to be destroyed.
That's coming at the end here. your
Say
time.
again?
If you wanted to wrap it up with 10
I'm
seconds or
literally in
so.
the last sentence.
Okay, sorry. You want to finish the sentence?
Yeah. So especially when we all know the West isn't willing to commit to any conflict for longer than 10 years in the first place. And so, of course, I literally have written down the statement. I'll stop here because it's only supposed to be 3 minutes. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sorry. I forgot to tell you. I told Kevin before. It's totally my fault. I was going to put the times in the side chat. So when you had 60 seconds, 30 seconds, 10 seconds left, that'll let you know.
Right.
But I guess you didn't need that. You ended almost perfectly. So anyway, sorry about that. But
Yeah, that's no problem.
all right, Kevin, I'll do it the same way for you. You can start, and I didn't start your time until you really got into your actual statement there. So if you want to go ahead, Kevin.
Okay, thanks, Henry. Thanks for moderating this, and thanks for coming on, Ray, so that we can actually do this debate. Liberalism, as Ray points out, has essentially brought about the most rapid growth and abundant prosperity of any economic mode up to this time in human history. And what we should bear in mind here is that, yes, liberalism does have its failings and its drawbacks, and that there are elements of liberalism that, if left to run amok and unregulated, they can actually take away and diverge from the ideal of the liberal Enlightenment. And what I think we really need to bear in mind here is that just because that rapid stage of abundant prosperity, as we saw in the main industrial revolution, isn't continued in the same growth rate to this day, doesn't mean that it's not still the best. In other words, yes, there was exponential growth, and that there are diminishing returns with time, but that even in an era of diminishing returns, as we've seen in the last little while, what we have essentially here is still the best system, and is still, even with all of that, still producing exceptional growth in the long run. And beyond simple market freedom, beyond simple prosperity in material terms, what liberalism delivers to people is autonomy, is agency, is individualism, which is completely in sync with human nature. And that so many of these other ideologies that attempt to rival liberalism, they do themselves a disservice by being unable to grapple with human nature. From communism, which tries to reform and mold human nature, to fascism, which does the same. We see that liberalism, through all of this, accepts the real world as it is, and that, yes, a lot of the imperfections in liberalism that we've seen have largely been the fault of specific policymakers and specific changes in directions that are an inevitable result of the democratic process. And yes, to Ray's point as well, it is clear that trajectory of abandoning things after 10 years and not being able to stay the course, that is a criticism of liberalism, and it's something which I at this channel try to fix and offer solutions for, but that we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater, that liberalism is the ultimate ideal. It is the epitome of human ingenuity and prosperity, and we have seen the absolute growth and abundance and prosperity delivered to the bulk of humanity by liberalism. And where that hasn't gone right, it's been the fault of the detractors of liberalism conniving against us. So thank you.
All right, yeah, that's right on. There's 3 minutes. So if you wanted to go ahead and get into the actual discussion, I guess it doesn't really matter which one. I guess Ray can start again since she's the one kind of leading it.
Okay. I'll just pick up on the first thing that you said. Where you said autonomy and individualism are, quote, in sync with human nature. Well, I mean, people say this all the time, but I mean, at the same time, liberalism is seeming to have a really hard time grappling with any form of collective identity, which also seems to be part of human nature, but which has been placed outside of consideration in terms of liberal thought. So, for example, when you have protesters who come out and say that they want, I don't know, I'm just going to pluck any of the random policy issues that have been going on for a while out of the air now. So let's say, for example, voters come out and demand, I don't know, $15 per hour for their work in the United States or something, which is some kind of class-based demand, surely, because I would expect that it's the working class demanding this. Liberalism seems to have a tough time grappling with the fact that there's actually a group of people called the working class who have some kind of shared interest with each other and aren't just atomized individuals in the workplace. That's the first one. The second one is liberalism having a very hard time grappling with what they like to derisively call identity politics, which is that people who have a shared history or a shared culture may identify more strongly with each other than they do with people who are from outside their own community. This is something that liberalism is having such a hard time actually dealing with, even though it's been natural throughout all of human history, that they've got like an entire cottage industry on the very online internet where people are just constantly complaining about identity politics, et cetera, right? So from my perspective, it doesn't look like liberalism is actually, quote, in sync with human nature. What would you say to that?
Well, I would say there that identity politics, as it relates to things such as race or class or whatnot, those at the end of the day represent essentially, and not to get too sort of sociological or whatnot or anything, but they represent at the end of the day somewhat social constructs. In other words, we can take, for example, look at race. Race is a real thing, but individualism trumps race at the end of the day, because say, for example, you have a black business owner and a white business owner where they work hard, they put a lot of effort into their businesses, and they're both very successful. Those guys have more in common with each other. Those women have more in common with each other than, say, a very ambitious and successful white business owner and a fan of, say, for example, Nick Fuentes, who just dwells in their basement all day and has no ambition whatsoever, yet they're both white. So at the end of the day, what we're talking about here is that individual characteristics and individual talent and drive and at the end of the day, agency trumps these sort of collective constructed manifestations that we can talk about. Class is another one where you mentioned the example of the $15 minimum wage. I mean, it should be pointed out there, a lot of the people that go to those protests are unemployed Berkeley or other progressive middle class, upper middle class students that want a virtue signal. A lot of working class people vote conservative or they vote Republican. They actually oppose those kinds of measures. So they because they understand the reality of what that would entail. But I know you brought that up as an example, so we don't have to get into the weeds of that specific case. But yeah, I just use that to illustrate individualism still trumping these constructed collective imaginations.
Well, I mean, I would argue that it depends on the historical conditions that you're talking about as well, because when it comes down to something like, I don't know, let's say another one that's been happening this year, which is the sort of this upsurge of conversation about, say, police violence, et cetera, right? When we hear these people from say Black Lives Matter, for example, talking about their negative experiences at the hands of specifically the American police, that can't be separated, really, in my view. It can't really be separated from the group experience that they would have had in being sort of abducted from their own countries across the Middle Passage and then forcibly integrated into the American economy in a way that basically made them into glorified farm tools, and then them being, quote, emancipated into an economy that had very little value or regard for their lives, and then sort of like the genesis of the American police being people who were tasked with returning slaves to their masters and so on. I mean, this is one of those things where it creates for them a shared identity of those who were abducted from the African continent that can't really be just dissipated by differing levels of economic prosperity later on down the line by about 200 years or so. Like, it's one of those things where they have to get up in the morning, I think, and they would probably look in the mirror. There's no way for them to avoid that historical fact. I mean, would you agree? Well, and liberalism can't seem to grapple with the fact that that's not going away, right?
Well, before I get into that, I just want to clarify your argument here. Are you arguing that essentially liberalism is tied in with slavery? I'm not saying they're uniquely responsible for this. What I'm saying is that liberalism seems to have a problem with grappling with the idea that the people who were the victims of that particular crime, and that crime that was meted out on a racialized basis, are going to share more in common with each other over that shared disaster than they would over, let's say, I don't know, what genre of music they prefer, or any other concern that would usually be seen in the atomized individualistic sense. Okay, well, I guess to kind of respond to your question there, Nobody's going to disagree on the matter of slavery and the abject atrocity that was committed there, and it was perpetrated by American slave owners. And yes, you're right, the police were in service of slave owners. That's part of their historical roots. But what we need to distinguish from that is the contemporary era of liberal America from slave owning America and the Confederacy and the legacy of that. And further, your point about the shared identity, that shared collective experience, I think that's valid. What I'll say is I think that that's valid, obviously. But the point about liberalism is that liberalism doesn't say, oh, you must view yourselves entirely as individuals and you can't care about your family or your friends or even people that are a similar race to you. It simply says, yes, you can have your solidarity or whatnot, but how far are we going to go with that? And I think, you're right to point out that people have an in-group sort of bias towards each other. The difference between, say, liberalism and fascism, though, is that liberalism still has a free society that people are free to interact with in that manner, whereas, say, ethno-nationalism or fascism says that is the most important bonding factor. That is the fabric of our society, whereas the liberal understanding of our society is that, yes, you're free to interact with whom you choose, but ethno-nationalism is inherently anti-liberal, and that's a bridge too far. And so what do you make of that, Ray? Because I feel that what you're kind of implying here is that legacy of slavery, for example, would necessitate or imply a collective grouping of those who are the descendants of who experienced it, that they are so united by that they should almost be their own country or something. Like, I'm just trying to understand the logical conclusion of what you're getting at here.
Well, so. I'm not prescribing. I wouldn't be able to prescribe for them either way as to how they should collectively react to that. But hypothetically, if they were to come up with some kind of ideology that involved, I don't know, let's say a desire to secede. Let's say they had that desire to secede and kind of create their own thing somewhere or something like this, right? Now, I mean, we could have conversations perhaps about the feasibility of that, because I'm sure that a feasibility study would find that would be extremely difficult to actually accomplish. But I wouldn't fault them on having the desire for that. Whereas I kind of feel like liberalism would immediately come out with a lecture on basically like, well, you're not allowed to do that because that would be morally wrong. I don't think it would be morally wrong if that was what they wanted to do in reaction to the oppression that they have suffered. I would only have questions about the actual feasibility of it.
So I guess that is a bit of a difference there, which is that what you're kind of saying or implying here is that we should look to the past and the grievances of the past, and we should spite all of the prosperity and gains of liberalism and the potential of liberalism to go to a reactionary and
no, I'm just saying I could understand why. I could understand why they might hypothetically feel as though they don't want to live under the same polity as the people who did this to them. Right?
But it's not the same
this is
people.
a random example I've chosen because I could have chosen any other random ethnic group to have this claim about. I could have done it much farther afield. For example, I could have said, for example, like if you consider, some of the conflicts that have happened in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. I mean, would you really place the same groups who have been known to have massacred each other previously under the same policy, or would they really be held as racist or something if they said, oh, well, we actually want to secede after having done X, Y, or Z? Or let's take Iraq, for example, right? If you're looking at Iraq, would you really want the Kurdish people, for example, to be living under the same political umbrella as the people who perpetrated massacres against them just 20 years ago?
Well, in the case of Iraq,
if you view the world like that, liberalism then has a very strange foreign policy where they're unable to understand why these people would not want to be in the same under the same government.
Okay, but Saddam Hussein and the Baathists were acting clearly in an anti-liberal manner. But to get to that point that you asked about with Iraq,
I'm not saying that liberalism did that, but I'm just saying that liberalism would have a problem with grappling with that issue. If you're saying on the one hand that you can't understand why African Americans would feel the way that they do toward the United States government, but then on the other hand, how does liberalism explain how the Kurdish people might feel toward living under Iraq? You see what I mean?
But we need to distinguish between Ba'athist Iraq and an Iraq with a liberal parliament that has free and fair elections where human rights are a thing and Kurds aren't getting gas. Those are two very different Iraqs. The latter Iraq was made possible by the neoconservative vanguard of the liberal order, the George W. Bush administration. So
but I mean, how can they actually trust that the government that has been democratically created is not going to immediately vote for bad things that the majority happens to believe? So, for example, when that government was constituted, it ended up leaning heavily in a kind of Shia direction, and it came under kind of like a, let's say, Iranian-style purview. As we all know, that went sideways pretty quickly. The Iranian-influenced politicians in Iraq started introducing a lot of legislation that was actually eyebrow raising. So I mean, I'm sure you heard about what was it called? It was called the Jafari Personal Law or something like this. I'm sure you remember that one. It was from 2009 or something, where they started trying to legalize child marriage and stuff like this, which was just completely unbelievable to the extent that document contained so many things that just violated the basic principles of what human rights are supposed to be about. But they were just like, oh, well, majority rules, right? So they kept trying to pass this stuff.
No, I'm not like one of those absolute democratic type of people. I'm a representative democracy advocate who believes that the military and foreign policy, especially as it relates to national interests, should be largely devolved away from mainstream democratic politics. I think that we need to have a more consistent trajectory over the long run. But when it comes to Iraq, you're talking, just so that everybody can be aware, Ray, you're talking to somebody who says, yes, there were problems with post-Saddam's Iraq that were largely attributable to Iranian interference. I'm the guy, I'm the neocon ghoul that would have invaded Iran at the same time. So that you can't fault me for that. I would have invaded Iran. So
okay, fair enough. But I mean, in terms of feasibility, how would you have been able to do both these things at the same time? I know this is slightly off the topic.
The U.S. did Afghanistan too. It would have been basically a single front war in essence. So from Iraq, from Basra to Kabul. So.
But I mean, you've got a significantly wider area of land there with I guess a significant population who will probably all rebel against you. I mean, obviously this is different from what you were actually saying, because I mean, I get that your sentiment was that you didn't agree with what was allowed to happen in Iraq as a consequence of Iranian influence, but the feasibility aspect of it is the part that I just.
Are we seriously arguing here that the most powerful superpower in the history of the world that was able to go into Afghanistan and Iraq and achieve victory couldn't also occupy a small portion of southwestern Iran to take 85% of their oil resources and bankrupt and cripple and run that regime into the ground? Are we seriously arguing that America couldn't do all three? That seems insane.
I mean, you're making an argument that I might have made in the past, because I might have said, for example, all right, is anyone seriously arguing that the United States can't just hold Afghanistan and then make the problem that exists there go away? Yeah, I mean, but then I'd be wrong years later, because of the fact that just today Stratfor actually published an incredible article explaining how the United States is presently allowing the Taliban tacitly to attack anything that is not a United States asset, insofar as it enables them to continue to claim that the peace deal is okay and that they can pull out of Afghanistan. So, I mean, if they're willing to do that with Afghanistan, with literally the people who enabled 9/11, then, I mean, is there anything that they can commit to? This is the thing that I'm talking about. And that's one of the things that really, really sort of came up as a strong signal to me that there is a problem here. And there is a problem with the way that policymakers have been doing things, or that we never understood that they were not fully committed. One of these two things. So, I mean, when you say that, oh, well, the United States that invaded Afghanistan could well have done Iran, I mean, I'm not confident of that, because they couldn't actually do Afghanistan.
Well, the United States was doing perfectly fine. The Taliban was pushed back. They went from controlling almost all the country in 2001 to controlling about 13% of the country. That was attributable to the lion, George W. Bush, and his administration.
Yeah, and I applauded
and it
that
was
Obama.
And it was Obama. Yeah, and it was Obama and Trump. Yeah, and it was Obama and Trump. That Stratfor report, I haven't actually had a chance to read that, but what it's referring to, I would imagine, is the absolute lack of leadership that was displayed by the pigeon Obama, and then his successor, who wanted to outdo him, Donald Trump. I'm a neocon. I'm not a fan of
that's
either.
basically what it says, right? It's obviously not blaming George W. Bush for having invaded it. It's rather placing at the feet of the subsequent administrations, who then kind of decided they were going to be like, oh, American people, what do you think of this? And then of course the American people were like, oh, we're bored now, and so the usual played out, right? But this is again something that would not happen if it were not for, or at least it'd be less likely to happen if it were not for the fact that there was this pervasive liberal view of just, I don't know, it's almost like a lack of commitment, because I don't understand how they were able to actually knock down 2 buildings in New York City, and then people just sort of, I don't know, walked off after a mere 15 years. They got tired of it. How do the people get tired of that?
Wait, so we're actually in agreement here. I talk about it on this channel all the time, how I'm so sick of this culture of what one of my friends Braden calls yo-yo politics, or yo-yo interventionism, where you go in and then you say, oh, we've been there too long, and then you go out before the job's done, and then another terror attack happens, and then you have to go back in. Exactly. And everybody who's anti-war and pro-Trump now votes for another Bush type figure after the next 9/11 happens. And so you and I believe, are both in agreement here that we need to have a more consistent and long-term focused trajectory to foreign policy. So like we don't actually disagree.
Yeah, we don't actually disagree on that particular issue. Like if you are going to act, then I mean, at the very bare minimum, I would at least hope that it would be consistent action in a way that actually improves international security. The problem we have right now, though, and I think one of the things that caused my community and yours to clash on this issue is, even while the United States is doing this yo-yo politics in the exact place where they don't need to be doing it, they're still trying to diversify their viewpoint to the entirety of planet Earth to try to essentially implement yo-yos in other places at the same time. So, for example, we've now got a yo-yo that has appeared in Western China, for example, which is where, if you go back to the year 2005, the United States position was, oh, we're just going to allow the Chinese government to do counterterrorism operations in the west of China, because that would provide a sort of add-on security for Afghanistan, because we know that there are actually contacts between the Afghan Taliban and the insurgents in Xinjiang, for example. Right? So that was the position in 2005, 2006, 2007, etc. Now, under Pompeo, during this time period, we've suddenly come to the bizarre conclusion that actually they're just actually okay with Islamic fundamentalism, even though those Islamic fundamentalists are definitely known to be in contact with the Afghan Taliban. And apparently the entirety of American foreign policy tool set needs to be somehow arrayed against China in order to accuse them of doing bad things in that location. And then, of course,
wait, we have to stop it there. We have to stop it there. So you're okay. I'm not going to say that there are no terrorists, that there are no radical Islamic terrorists in Xinjiang, but upwards of 1.5 million Uyghurs being detained and having their culture basically driven away and synicized against their will. In essentially what are modern day gulags, that's justified in your view? I want to understand, like, well, because that seems like saying that the Holocaust was justified because there were a few Jews that shot at Nazi installations. It's like, it's true, there were some Jews that resisted Hitler. That's actually a good thing. Like, communist China is our enemy.
Wait. Are we really comparing China to Nazi Germany though?
Well, communist China actually killed more people. They've killed about 100 million people since their inception. Hitler killed about 50 million. So there's a difference.
No. I mean, are you really saying that China is a greater enemy to you right now than the Islamic fundamentalists in Central Asia? I mean, that's the call that China's got, because you can't fight everything at once.
No, I'm aware you can't fight everything at once. That's true. China's got 300 nukes aimed at the West. How many do these radical terrorists have? They're trying to.
They will never fire them because mutually assured destruction. I mean, you both have nukes pointed at each other. Everyone in that region has nukes pointed at each other. I mean, Pakistan and India have nukes pointed at each other, right? But I don't think they should rate themselves as being their biggest threat, given that the persistent attacks against soft targets are all coming from these Islamic fundamentalists. Like, we're supposed to be in the so-called global war on terror, except everyone seems to be doing everything except that particular war right now.
Well, Yeah, but those specific people that you're referring to in Xinjiang aren't responsible for 9/11. They're actually fighting communist China. And now I don't agree with their ideology, but they, in a way, are kind of like the modern Mujahideen, which is like, yeah, they're not exactly good guys, but they're fighting an evil empire. That's
No, but
literally...
isn't this how the whole problem started in the first place after 1953, when Dwight Eisenhower decided that he was going to cultivate this sort of Islamic fundamentalist sphere under the basis that, oh, well, they're gonna fight against the USSR, and then everything's going to be fine. And then what happens instead? They always metastasize and start attacking other things that are different from what you would like them to attack, because they don't think about it the way that you think about it. They think about it completely differently. These fundamentalists believe that all of us are actually bad and that all of us need to be attacked in due time. So why would we play with them knowing that they're eventually going to come for us? Which is what happens every time.
Because we can't go to war with everybody at once, and there are greater evils and lesser evils. It's the same reason I would have worked with communist China against the Soviet Union like Nixon did. That was smart, because he knew...
So why don't we, or tacitly, because I'm not asking you to explicitly do so, why don't you just tacitly allow China to deal with the Islamic fundamentalists then?
Because communist China is a bigger threat to the West than Islamic fundamentalism. So right now, at least, we can deal with it. We deal with these terrorists after, kind of like with the Soviet Union. Soviets had 40,000 nukes aimed at America in the 1980s. How many did the Mujahideen have? Nothing. Were they bad? Yes, and some of them did go on to become the Taliban. But what you're kind of implying here is that Eisenhower was a bit of a dum-dum and he didn't really realize what was going to happen. No, he knew that there would be blowback. That blowback, as he was right, turned out to be far less than the threat of the Soviet Union. In other words, if you don't deal with the bigger problem now, you won't even be alive. You won't even have a civilization to deal with the blowback later.
I mean, I understand what you're saying there. But I mean, have you all considered that part of the reason that the United States ends up depending on Islamic fundamentalists to do groundwork against other advanced civilizations is because of the fact that they are unwilling to build actual, unwilling or incapable to build on the ground actual counter-system movements. Like, why is the counter-system movement never, I don't know, some form of social democracy? Why is the counter-system movement never the United States building something that is that can actually be respected instead of just utilizing other bad people to do things against people who are more organized and possibly less bad? It seems very strange to me that this is constantly happening. I have a feeling that it's because liberalism doesn't have an answer to problems in the third world, and so it is forced to rely on reactionary movements in that sphere to do its work for it.
These reactionary movements, a good example would be Nicaragua, for example, with the Contras. Those reactionary movements that you're talking about, if you win and they win and you prevail and they prevail on the ground there, you have leverage over them. Jean Kirkpatrick talked about it a lot while she was alive, this idea that a Western dictatorship, a pro-Western dictatorship, is better than an anti-Western dictatorship, because if Pinochet wins or if the Contras win, then after they consolidate power, you have pressure and leverage over them to slowly reform and democratize. Whereas if the Soviets win and you let them take Chile and you let them take... Can you just let me speak for a minute?
No, sorry, go on then.
Yeah, so if you let the Soviets prevail in Nicaragua and Chile, then their end goal for all of time is a dictatorship, a puppet state. So, and they'll never democratize because they're anti-democratic. That's their ideology. So what you're basically getting at here is this idea that wouldn't it be nice if the agents on the ground, like the Mujahideen and whatnot, were just as liberal and democratic as the West? The problem is that takes a lot of time to cultivate that. And the reality on the ground right now is that in a lot of these countries, you're faced with either right-wing straw men that you can have leverage over, or left-wing death squads that you don't and want to destroy you. Well, then we're obviously going to side with the what you call the reactionary forces over the communist forces, because they can be leveraged into liberalization with time, like Pinochet was, for example, or the college would have been.
Okay, but the thing that I'm going to highlight here is that the comparison you're making now is different from the one that we were actually talking about previously. Because it's in Latin America, you could understand, although I don't necessarily agree, I could understand how someone could come to the conclusion that, okay, you set up a liberal dictatorship and then it kind of self-democratizes itself out of the state of emergency into the kind of system that you wanted to see. However, when you're talking about the Mujahideen, you're not going to get that to happen. I think we all know ahead of time, you're not going to have the Mujahideen is not going to somehow democratize itself out of Islamic fundamentalism. It has never been known to do that. So this is a completely different scenario we're talking about there. Like that.
Well, I don't disagree.
They're just going to set up a sort of, well, we already know what the kind of system they would set up would obviously not be a liberal democracy.
No, I don't disagree. But
it would never reform.
I think you're missing my point, though. Would you disagree with this idea, Ray, that the Soviet Union aiming 40,000 nukes at America right now is a bit of a bigger threat than maybe the Mujahideen wins and then becomes the Taliban in 20 years? At least we'll be alive in 20 years. Don't you understand why they were the lesser evil?
Okay, in the context of the Soviet Union, I mean, that was essentially a battle in the third. That was a battle in the third world between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, in which the United States leaned toward the People's Republic of China, right? Because it was the lesser of the two evils in that context. Like
Afghanistan, but the Soviets invaded Afghanistan to enforce communism on them.
That is one of those things where you had an agenda which was to make sure that the Soviet Union would lose. They made the crucial mistake of actually invading the entirety of Afghanistan under the delusion that they could actually hold it. It didn't work. In the case of what's happening with China, this is already a part of their territory which is integrated. It's 1/6 of their landmass. You go and create a gigantic conflagration in the middle of that, it's going to have consequences that will affect you almost immediately. Because how can you win Afghanistan if you've got 1/6 of China's landmass supporting Islamic insurgency there? Because it's going to be a transnational movement, as it always is.
Well, yes, but I guess this is a bit of a difference in our understanding. I don't view the Communist Chinese Party as having legitimate sovereignty. That should be the Republic of China. So this idea, that's like saying that Tibet is part of Communist China. It's like, no, it's not. It's occupied territory. I want to Balkanize them ideally, or at least liberate them such that we have a liberal democratic government that is currently in exile in Taipei, that it has legitimate sovereignty over that territory. I fail to see how an ascendant superpower that is going to transition away from their minimal deterrence of 300 nukes to eventually try to get parity with America in short order, that is currently vying to be the largest economy in the world. I fail to see how they're not as big a threat as a ragtag group of basically freedom fighters. I don't get that.
It's because it's a difference in rationality. So, for example, we can say that the People's Republic of China is actually a rational actor, even though it is not a liberal democracy, right? Much like how I'm sure that you would make the argument that there are plenty of regimes in the Middle East, such as, say, Jordan, for example, is a rational actor, even though it is not a liberal democracy, etc., etc. Right.
But so was Stalin.
However, do we believe that Islamic fundamentalist terrorists can be rational actors that aren't going to just blow themselves up to hurt us? As they have done in the past, multiple times.
That's a bit tricky. In most cases, no, but some people characterize the House of Saud as radical Islamic terrorists, which they're not. They are a rational actor. Would you disagree with that?
I would say that as much as I despise Saudi Arabia, it is a rational actor at the very least. So I would not counsel to have, for example, Saudi Arabia overthrown by its own citizens, because I'm sure that its own citizens are actually not rational actors, if you get what I mean. Because
they're Wahhabist
would be worse. So exactly. So on a similar level, if you were to quote replace the Chinese government with whatever else is going to follow in this balkanized area, I don't think that the people who would replace them would be rational actors in most cases.
But okay, that's a bit of a wild card that you're getting at.
I mean, how is it different though?
No. But so having a rational enemy that seeks your destruction and has a unified party that's building up its navy and its economy and will soon be building up its nuclear forces against you, and they're rational, that's, to me, that's more scary than having them become divided conflagration. It's the same with Russia. If I could have it my way, Russia would be every oblast in Russia would be its own country, and they'd all be fighting each other. Because then we're not going to have to deal with this massive nuclear threat of a united dictatorship.
Well, I mean, I kind of Well, I mean, I hear you on that, and I kind of feel like I can. I mean, the difference between Russia and China on this one, for example, would be, let's say that you had like a complete disintegration. And again, this is a hypothesis, so I hope not to have the sort of the Russia stands or whatever quoting me on this later. Like if I said you should do this, I'm just saying hypothetically. Hypothetically, let's imagine that the entirety of Russian-controlled Siberia were to like split up into its component parts and become a complete mess. Right? This would probably not have a gigantic sort of death spiral effect on the global economy because of the fact that Russia is not instrumental to the production of most goods that exist.
Okay.
I mean, they're obviously a key energy supplier, but again, the energy is under Siberia. I'm assuming that if the place were to balkanize itself in Siberia, then you would have companies in those locations that are pumping that oil, but still continue to operate, perhaps just under different ownership, right?
Yep.
Whereas in the context of the PRC, if you were to balkanize the entirety of that, you've just destroyed basically the supply chain that is the backbone of a large amount of production on planet Earth, right? So you're going to have an economic backlash that is going to be severe and immediate, right, across the whole of the productive process. So it's qualitatively a different enterprise you'd be undertaking there. I mean, do you agree?
No. I guess you're not aware. I mean, it's fine. But one of the things that I talk about all the time is that what we need to do is get off this neoliberal status quo of being addicted to cheap crap from communist China. The one thing that I'll say that Marx was kind of right about was that he predicted that the excess and greed of the bourgeois capitalist class would know no bounds, and that they would bring about their own destruction by being too greedy to not ward off against threats because of the profit motive. Now, I'm not a Marxist. I support capitalism, but I think that if you defended capitalism and you cared about capitalism, you would bear that in mind. Right now, our neoliberal establishment is playing right into what Marx envisioned, where they're trading with communist China, even though the communists seek our destruction of our capitalist system because they're too greedy to see an enemy for what it is. I would treat communist China the way that I would have treated the Soviet Union. No trade with them, total blockade, total sanctions on anybody that violates it, and transfer all non-essential production over to India, which is a democratic democracy, or a democratic capitalist system, which is fighting Islamic fascism in China or in Pakistan and fighting communism in China. And I would bring all essential manufacturing back to Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom. So when you say, but China is a huge part of the economy, I don't disagree with you. And they are a much bigger share of global GDP than Russia. And I agree with you on that. But that's the problem. That's the problem. We never should have allowed this. After the 90s, after the Soviets fell, we should have treated the Red China as the new enemy, and we should have cut them off from the world economy. So when you say, but they're a huge part of the economy, that's like, yeah, I'm against that. That's what I talk about all the time here. We need to change that. So.
Okay, but I mean, if this involved pivoting manufacturing to India, I mean, the Western world consciously chose not to do that because of the fact that Western liberalism and basically the legacy of British colonialism had, let's say, an outsized influence over the trajectory that India would take in its development, but did not have that influence over China's development because, of course, China was at that point under the auspices of the CPC, right? So, I mean, the West already had the chance to have India be their manufacturing hub, and it basically blew it because, as we all know, India has not yet reached a point of development where they could actually conceivably replace China in the world.
Right. Well, that's why we need a Marshall Plan directed at India to get them up to the stage that they can replace Red China as the manufacturing base, because we're basically in another Cold War. We need extreme solutions for extreme problems, and our establishment here has been too addicted to cheap Chinese crap that they've allowed themselves to enrich the communists and build up their navy against us. And so what you're on, like, I guess, if you're critical of neoliberalism, so am I. I'm critical of that all the time, the modern manifestation of neoliberalism.
Okay, but I mean, would you be willing to accept, though, that in order to get India to be something that could replace China, the process of doing that would actually make India begin to resemble China in some way? It would just be aligned to you, yes, but it would begin to resemble it structurally, because of the fact that you wouldn't be able to have this sort of fractious liberal democracy in which each state in India is contesting against the other state, and then you've got the usual liberal democratic system at the top in which you have to have the different interest groups lobbying each other, and that whole structure is part of what makes India as inefficient as it presently is at basically doing the thing that you would want it to do. You would have to make India be actually slightly more authoritarian and dictatorial in order to achieve the result of being able to compete against China. Would you accept that?
Well, here's what India needs. India has a lot of bureaucratic red tape and some legacy of basically Russian-sponsored socialism there. Though they are fighting the Naxals, they are fighting communist China's proxies that are basically communist terrorists in their own territory. The thing about India is India has a lot of inefficiency and red tape. What they need is they need somebody who's going to come in there and cut down all the red tape and say, look, we are having a liberal economy, but we're going to preserve our democratic institutions. But we need to understand that there's a lot of dead weight that needs to be removed here. And you're right to point out that India, under its current system, is so cluttered by red tape that it can't really replace communist China. Whereas even the communists said, look, we're going to have some special economic zones where our bureaucracy doesn't really apply. Even the communists understood that capitalism was a tool that can make you rich. What we need to understand in India is that India can do the same, and India already shares our values in a large part. And as far as the point about authoritarianism and whatnot, some people would actually consider Narendra Modi to be an authoritarian, even though he's an elected official. So I think that on that point, this idea of, but you'd have to be a bit more authoritarian in India, as opposed to what we're doing right now, which is enriching a totalitarian system in China. Sure, that's still a lesser evil. But what you said, though, about how India would have to basically become China, what I disagree there is that you're basically implying that they would have to become an authoritarian communist system to have that manufacturing base. Yet we've seen very clearly that you can have a capitalist democratic system or a capitalist authoritarian system can also have a manufacturing base.
I mean, maybe I shouldn't have said exclusively China, but I was just using that as the comparison example. Like, I mean, you could also say that it would have to become a very large version of 1960s, 1970s South Korea, for example, which was also a dictatorship.
That'd be base.
Also a dictatorship, though.
Yes, but they were fighting the communists. They were a loyal American ally, without question, and they were radically opposed to the forces that were seeking their destruction. And now look at South Korea. I don't think anybody would have agreed that South Korea was ready for what we basically have today. Back then, they would have become engulfed by North Korea if we had like a Moon Jae-in back then.
So we're actually in agreement on that point. It's just that I parlay that into a larger point, which is that if in 2020 you were to have the ascendancy of a leader in India who was basically just a clone of Park Chung-hee, for example, and decided he was going to implement developmentalist South Korea style economics across the entire country and basically just, abolished large amounts of red tape, removed entire swathes of bureaucracy, essentially de-British Rajed the whole place, right? Imagine if they did that. I mean, perhaps you might find that to be a strategically great thing to happen, but how would
But the Indian people would get rich.
Indeed, but how would Western liberalism cope with that while it is happening? That's the question.
But what do you mean? But it would be the same as South Korea. South Korea is a liberal democracy and capitalist right now, where they always know, but they had to take some tough actions to get there. And India
in the 1960s, in the 1960s and 1970s, for whatever reason, during that time period, it was possible to carry out that kind of activity and kind of slide it past the public and past politicians and so on and get away with it, right? Not even once, but in fact twice, because Chun Doo-hwan then came and declared his own dictatorship after Park was gone and was able to do it again in the 1980s as well, right? And again, they, quote, got away with it, mostly. Although everyone was prosecuted afterwards, they basically got away with it at the time without the United States pulling out the rug from under them. Right,
but would you disagree that was good for the people of South Korea? I
do think that what Chun Doo-hwan did was necessary. Like there was other option he could have had. However, I somehow don't think that you could actually get away with doing that in the year 2020 and not have the US pull out the rug from under you almost immediately.
Well, if that happened, that would be because of Russian and Chinese interference to try to co-opt people to make them anti-war and anti-U.S. interests, basically. In other words, we got people on our own side in our own country that live here, that live in Canada, that live in the U.S., that live in the United Kingdom, that are simping for our enemies, that aim the most powerful weapons in the universe against us. So that's a problem that we didn't really have in the 60s. Everybody knew their allegiance back then. So
I mean, I would argue that it would probably not be just that, but it would be that liberalism itself would have a problem reconciling the actions that it is tacitly supporting with what it's supposed to be, quote unquote, supporting. You would have people saying that, oh, we can't support these dictators or et cetera, because they're doing developments or they're competing with us or something. You might even have nativists in the US complaining that India is, quote, stealing their jobs or something ridiculous.
Yeah,
and then you're going to get that happening again.
Yeah, those people are fifth columns, and I'm against that whole movement, the MAGA guys and stuff. Like, I'm protectionist to a degree. I'm not a neoliberal, but there's a difference between essential manufacturing being brought here and just doing everything here like a North Korean style system. The thing is, here's where you're wrong though on that, Ray, which is that right now the West is working with Jordan. The West is working with Saudi Arabia. Does anybody think Saudi Arabia and Jordan are democracies? No, but they're helping us. They help us on the oil markets. They help us with stability and peace in the Middle East. And they're progressing in our image. And so you're actually wrong to say that we wouldn't tolerate it, because we do right now with Saudi Arabia. So I don't see the difference.
Okay, but I mean, do you think that I mean, I was going to ask this at the beginning, but somehow you ended up going down a different path. But I was going to ask, if your idea for using India or utilizing India as the counterweight to China in terms of manufacturing, let's say that everything went the way that you just described, or that I just described over the past 5 minutes, right? Let's say that went that way. Do you guys imagine that Hindu nationalists who would be empowered by the fact that their country would now be suddenly dramatically more rich than it was and would be reaching parity with China, do you guys imagine that they're going to put aside the issues they have had with the West over the past 400 years? Or do you think that they would take that as an opportunity to become your next problem?
If they become,
I would wager that they would become your next problem.
Yeah, well, and you know what? I'll take Hindu nationalists that we can agree a lot on when it comes to economics over communist nationalists that we disagree with on everything. So yeah, you're right that they wouldn't share the West's vision 100% in that sense. We'd have leverage over them that we don't really have over China. We gave leverage to China, and we could shape them slowly in our image. But yes, there is always going to be a contingency in India that isn't 100% Western or whatnot. I'll take those guys over the communist thugs in Beijing that have butchered 100 million people since 1949. Sign me up, you know? That sounds great. I'll take Hindu nationalism over communism any day. So.
I mean, perhaps you would, but historically, has the United States been known to consistently make that choice at the end of the day? Because I think the last couple of times that this happened, they didn't make that choice. So, for example, 1937, I know this is kind of a weird one for me to go back to, but 1937, you had some people in Japan who could arguably be said to have been adherents of Shintoism and Buddhism, who decided they were going to create a nationalist quasi-dictatorship in order to, quote unquote, resist the communists who were in China and to resist the Soviet Union, blah, blah, etc. The United States went into that, slapped sanctions on them anyway, and then proceeded to, carry forth the set of events that then led to what happened later. Now, obviously, I'm glossing over.
Wait, are you blaming Pearl Harbor on sanctioning?
No, I'm not. I'm saying I'm glossing over a large amount of intricacy that obviously was involved in that. But I'm saying, how do we know that India, for you, after you've had sort of this relationship with India, how do we know that liberals wouldn't end up viewing India the same way that the Empire of Japan was viewed?
Well, it really depends on what you mean by liberals, because if we're talking about like weak leaders like Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama, they don't understand the national security interests at all. But if we're talking about liberal leaders like Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush, they get it. They get it. Like, what kind of liberals are we talking about? Liberalism is so vast. Are we talking about conservative liberals, or are we talking about like progressive social democratic liberals?
I mean all of them when it is rectified into the final output of whatever the foreign policy is going to be. So that could be the result after a bipartisan kind of fight session as it happens. You get like one output, which is the policy prescription for like the next 4 years, the next 8 years, etc., or perhaps even the next 16 years, depending on how deeply the doctrine goes into the institutions. So like I understand your perspective on this, but how do we know this American institutions wouldn't end up designating India eventually in the way that you described if it developed in the way that you described, would end up designating India as a serious national security threat or some kind of ideological threat because of its growing influence over the subcontinent.
Well, I would be surprised if that did happen, and here's why. Because they haven't done it with Communist China yet. They're still trading with them. They're still getting cozy. Justin Trudeau still wants to train their troops, for example. The neoliberal establishment in the West is totally happy still to outsource to Communist China and to enrich them and let them run amok over our markets and change our scripts in Hollywood, our main center of propaganda.
So, I mean, to be fair, they've got sanctions on specific Chinese officials right now. I mean, it's more hostile now than it was at least 4 years ago, right?
Finally, but for 30 years, the West was happy to let China get a pass on everything. So I don't see why India would immediately be...
Where they'd get a pass for maybe like 25 years, 30 years or something, and then eventually you would have the repeat of this same cycle again, where it's like, okay, well, they're differing from liberalism. Their influence is growing. They've got associations with other religious groups in other countries. Or let's say, for example, India in the Northeast has this tacit kind of agreement with Myanmar over sort of patrolling borders and arresting people who they say are Islamic terrorists. Right? Now, the United States position on Myanmar is that Myanmar is actually a state which is engaged in massive human rights violations under that pretext, right? So what happens when Hindu nationalists begin to reach out to those people in other states who agree with them on certain policies that you guys are actually totally against? At what point does it become now India is the next problem? That's the question I'm asking, because of the fact that
okay. But that's like saying to the Mujahideen, but hey, look, we can't use the Mujahideen against the Soviet empire that's aiming 40,000 nukes at us, because after we win, some of them will go on and become the Taliban. It's like, okay, if we have that attitude, we're not going to win the Cold War. We won't even be alive to see the blowback from that. Like, I'm not going to say here that it's going to go 100% perfectly, but if we're going to seriously have an argument over, or a debate over whether communism, a communist regime that's killed 100 million people and is an ascendant rival, is a lesser threat than some Hindu nationalists, I don't see that. The Hindu nationalists are way more in sync with us than the communists in China are. I don't get that.
Okay, I'm not saying that one or the other is better or worse.
But I am. If you can't tell that difference, then you're an apologist for the CCP. How are the Hindu nationalists?
I'm just saying that if you're capable of rationalizing one, then why is the other one beyond comprehension?
So are you arguing basically that the liberal world has to invade everybody and can't leverage and pressure to reform anybody? We just have to invade Saudi Arabia. We can't pressure to reform them. We can't have leverage over them. We just have to invade them because they're not 100% liberal democracy. That's not how the real world works. I don't understand this idea that we can't deal with the main evil empire right now, because it might empower some people that are not as bad, but they might have some disagreements with us in the future. Like, we'll come to that when we come to that. We have an existential threat.
This seems like I'm just saying it seems like an inconsistency to me. And also, atop that, it is unclear as to how different powers get designated as the main threat at any given time.
Well, I would consider
what makes China now the main threat as opposed to Russia?
Well, I'm not one of those people who says we should give Russia a pass and focus on China. I did a video, What About China, though, where I was arguing against people that would always say, oh, why do you care so much about Russia? China is the problem. They were mostly alt-right figures. I want to get up on both of them. I view Russia as a more immediate and urgent threat to our security because they're making moves and they're desperate, whereas communist China is playing this long game of building up their economy, and they'll play this out another 50 years. And so I actually support getting tough on Russia first, immediately, in terms of expelling them from Europe and whatnot, and then I would go after China after. Though I would still blockade China and everything. But when it comes to China, the reason why they're a threat to us is that we know their party is enriching the North Korean regime, which is seeking to conduct nuclear blackmail against the West so that they can unilaterally take the South and the West will not intervene because we don't want to get nuked. They are making moves in the South China Sea. They are responsible for this virus that is ran amok in our economies and Douglas Murray was on talk radio today talking about it, basically how they are we're one of the only countries now that might come out of this, if you believe their numbers, which I don't, and I don't really think he does either, but with slightly positive gain. In other words, they don't even care when their own people die, so they're laughing as our people die. And their ideology is 100% anathema to ours. They seek to use the international institutions such as the WTO and the logic of capitalism against us. And they seek to drive us into debt. And they seek to sow discord in our civilization. And if we can't recognize them as a threat, then we are hopelessly lost in terms of winning the new Cold War. So that's my view on it.
The thing is, why are we having a new Cold War as opposed to having the Great Game 2? Because this, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm always out of date when it comes to how rapidly things have turned the other way now. But as far as I understood it, we were supposed to have been in something called the Great Game 2, which was all about how is influence going to be parceled out in the context of Central Asia and where Central Asia meets the borders of Eastern Europe, right? So in that kind of heartland space. Right? Who is going to have influence there and to what end? And as far as I understood it, the objective was to diminish Russian influence by any means necessary. And by any means necessary included allowing China to make gains in Central Asia at Russia's expense with the tacit toleration of the United States and Western Europe, right? That was what was supposed to have been happening. Why? Because Russia was deemed to be a larger and more unpredictable threat than China ever would be. Why? Because in order to prevent China from doing things which it should not be doing, you can be in the South China Sea. You can be coordinating with other Asian countries in the South China Sea to put up defensive measures to deter China from making stupid actions in that sea. Right? While at the same time understanding that they also are human beings who have concerns and may view the situation in a way that is completely different from how we view it, right? So taking all of that into account, the other thing is that allowing China to engage in these activities in Central Asia, these investments and so on at Russia's expense, thus eating into Russia's influence and diminishing it, was redirecting China's attention into areas where they would in the future become entangled, which would then leave us with less work to do in other parts of Asia where we would like to be defensive toward China, right? To me, this seemed like it was a common sense position, but now the United States has completely upended this and decided that they're going for China first and foremost, and that policy on Russia. I mean, when was the last time you heard someone talking about doing something to Russia in any way that would harm them? They've been essentially enabled to get away with annexing Crimea without anyone doing anything about it. They are still negotiating or trying to get their what is that pipeline called again? The one that they're doing they're trying to do with Germany right now.
Oh, the Nord Stream.
Yeah, they're still engaged in having conversations about that because that hasn't been sufficiently shot down yet. No one seems to be doing anything about it. So why are we allowing Russia to control energy politics in Europe, for example? But we're all like focused like a laser on like what China is doing internally to like its own people or something.
Well,
surely one of these should be more priority than the other.
Well, I don't necessarily disagree with a lot of the substance that you had to say there, but what I will say is, we're about 70 minutes into this, and I like, are you guys okay with an intermission of like 2 or 3 minutes?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I was actually going to suggest that at an hour. I was going to suggest maybe shifting the topic because you guys were talking a lot about foreign policy, which makes sense knowing the two of you.
Oh yeah. The next thing that we should do then, I guess, is the coronavirus response.
Exactly. Yeah. I almost suggested that because Kevin had brought it up, and I almost suggested you guys talk about the difference in effectiveness of the responses of, say, liberal nations versus more collectivist nations. I thought that
one blew me away. So yes, I do have things to say on that.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think we should do the intermission for say 3 minutes, but I think we should have a few minutes to wrap up this though, because there was.
Oh yeah. Obviously, if you guys have final.
Yeah, I think Kevin did want to respond to me, and it would be kind of weird if I just like said a thing and then we're okay, intermission. Yeah. No, I'll let him respond. No, that's good for him to respond.
Okay, yeah, but we I gotta go get more water and stuff. I'll be back in a few minutes.
Okay.
Or like 2 minutes.
All right, sounds good.
Has he left us in live intermission? So we shouldn't say anything then. Yeah, it seems you're still live. Okay, I won't say anything.
All right. Looks like Kevin's back. I don't know about Ray.
Oh yeah, I'm good.
Oh, okay. Yeah, if y'all, I
Okay.
assume Kevin, you're all good to go and everything. So did you want to finish up on that last topic, Kevin, or?
Yeah, I did, because again, I think that Ray and I have some common ground there, which is that I'm extremely critical of the weakness that Obama had with Eastern Europe, where, yeah, he basically let Russia go into Crimea as well as Eastern Ukraine. And I think personally, the world would be a lot different if John McCain had won in 2008 and in 2012. We would have a liberated democratic Syria right now. Ukraine would be sovereign. Georgia would be fully sovereign and intact. It would just be a very different world. And I think that just this idea that, yes, there are weak leaders that have come to represent the liberal order, including Angela Merkel, that I really have a lot of issues with. But it doesn't mean that we should just abandon the liberal project and then just become like our enemies because, we have some problems here and there. I think that we should be trying to make the West stronger, but we shouldn't just throw out the project of the West in that process. That's kind of my view on that. And so what I would like to see is a more consistent and less democratically influenced foreign policy, though, because our national security is just too important. And, it's something that Machiavelli wrote about like 600 years ago, where he said in Discourses on Livy that a democracy that's incapable in a time of crisis of at least thinking like a dictatorship won't survive to be a democracy anymore. And a dictatorship that's incapable in a crisis of thinking like a democracy won't be around to be a dictator anymore. The people will come for their head, basically. And so that is a point that I agree with. And it's one of the reasons why, for example, I'm fully supportive of Saudi Arabia, fully supportive of Pinochet and everything, even though I disagree with what they have done and whatnot, because if we're unwilling to work with bad actors, we won't even be around to have our good things continue into the future. The forces of darkness, the continents of slavery will inherit the world, and at best will be regarded and discarded and relegated to any relevant cluster of small countries isolated on the Americas. And at worst, we will be completely vanquished and extinguished. And in 8,000 years, nobody will even remember what the West was. And the Enlightenment will have been 7,000 years dead or more. So that's my view on that. And I guess, if Ray has a follow up to that, that's good. Otherwise, we can move on to the coronavirus. But I'm extremely critical of Merkel, Obama, and their ilk. And I think that is a blemish on liberalism. But I think it's an individual problem with those leaders and their weakness, not a problem with the West and the Enlightenment and liberalism at large. We shouldn't just throw that all out because Obama and Merkel are bad. That's like what the alt-right wants to do. They see the West as weak right now, so they say, instead of making the West strong, how about we just join Putin? Because he's strong, bro. It's like, well, I actually have principles that I want to strengthen and preserve here. So that's my view.
Well, I mean, I understand where you're coming from on that, because I am not advocating that the West should become not whatever it is for obvious reasons. I wouldn't want to prescribe to them how they should be. But at the same time, and this is obviously going to take us into the next topic anyway, at the same time, it becomes difficult to imagine how this project can continue to maintain itself if it is so engaged externally, but at the same time, it can't do basics that it's supposed to be able to do internally, which again, law enforcement and basic public health mandates, right? So, I mean, we're moving into the coronavirus thing right now anyway. So I'm assuming I don't know if Henry wants to kind of like introduce that topic formally in some way, or I can just go straight in.
I mean, I think we already did. I guess the way I had framed it was just a few guys were going to discuss the kind of the difference in the effectiveness of the response between liberal nations and more collectivist nations, and maybe the benefits of liberalism versus collectivism trying to deal with the coronavirus. And if you want to you could even broaden it if you wanted to talk. Maybe that's too much to talk about law enforcement.
I mean, obviously these things are
you want to talk about all domestic issues, maybe, but
Yeah,
know,
I'm not going to go to. I'm not going to go to all domestic issues because that would be we would be here for like several years. But I mean, just on public health and law enforcement. And by law enforcement, I mean in this context, obviously, like the enforcement of mask mandates, the enforcement of stay-at-home orders, quarantine, etc. Right. So first thing I'm going to say out of the gate is I get the United States institutions actually did have a way of dealing with this. For example, the CDC has under its purview the authority to put people in quarantine if they need to be, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not arguing that the liberal system is incapable of doing basic quarantines and doing basic cordons and basically limiting flows of populations from one place to another if it needs to. In fact, we have seen there are ostensibly quote-unquote liberal-ish states in East Asia that actually did do that, despite the fact that ordinarily freedoms quote-unquote would prevent people from being able to implement these things. So I'm not saying that liberalism is literally incapable of doing sort of basic public health. However, it would seem that the more fervently the belief in liberalism is, the less effective the response was. So, for example, we saw in the United States people asserting that it was their liberal freedom to not have to use masks, or that it was their quote-unquote liberal freedom to essentially walk around toting guns in the air and essentially acting like MAGA bros, right? And coughing on each other, essentially, and just spreading the virus for no apparent reason. We saw in the United Kingdom, despite the emergence of a new strain a couple of days ago, people still thought it was their freedom individually to jump onto trains and leave the region of London, despite the fact that the lockdown was about to come into effect, thus spreading the new variant of the virus all over the entire island. This is one of those things where if politicians could have just suspended their desire to be seen as good liberals for just about a couple of days, they could have devised a plan that could have actually, although it would have put their reputation, perhaps their legacy at risk, because they would, of course, be criticized in their legacy for having, quote, reacted harshly, et cetera, they would have been able to control this virus, and it would have been, long-term effects would have been much better. But because everyone was worried about, what are people going to say about my legacy? What about liberal democracy? Will I be voted out the next term? Et cetera, you ended up with populations refusing to obey the law and politicians refusing to implement the law. Sorry, to advocate for enforcing the law. Now, I'm going on for quite a bit here, so I'll give Kevin a chance to respond. But I mean, do you accept that the more fervently people believed in liberal individualism, the less likely they were to actually give a proper public health response?
Well, on that point, I would say that a good counter to that, though, would be, for example, the response in South Korea, where South Korea is a liberal democracy, and yet they handled the virus fairly well. I don't think that liberalism and treating a pandemic responsibly are incompatible with each other. I think that one of the problems that you see in the United Kingdom and in the United States is a specific strain of more libertarianism, which has its illiberal tendencies, namely to simp for dictators and stuff as well abroad, that a lot of those people, they rejected the virus either as a hoax or said that it wouldn't really affect them. I've never been in that camp. I've been very disappointed with a lot of conservatives over their disregard of the virus, because I've said this should be a rallying point where all conservatives can recognize, this is real, and we need to have this as a Sputnik moment where we say, never again, we are going to destroy the regime that brought this upon us, instead of saying, oh, it's just fake, bro, it's George Soros. That's such a disgrace. That's like saying to the Soviet Union, oh, they've got a satellite now, which means that they can put basically an H-bomb on Washington if they wanted to. No, that's just a hoax, bro. Space is fake, bro. Like, imagine if the conservatives in America responded that way during the Cold War. The Soviets would have won the Cold War. We can't let the same thing happen in the new Cold War. I think this criticism of individual politicians being weak on the pandemic, again, it's kind of conflating the project of the West with the personal eccentricities of Donald Trump and Boris Johnson. So
I would go further than that, because I would say that the whole system seemed to be designed to not produce the correct outcome. Like, if we look at the United Kingdom as a key example of this, it wasn't just Boris Johnson alone, because of the fact that in the years previously, the pandemic response plan that had been drawn up, for example, the United Kingdom's pandemic response plan, a lot of people don't seem to remember this, but the United Kingdom's pandemic response plan was implemented in exactly one place. It was implemented in Singapore because they copied the United Kingdom's pandemic response plan. It's just the difference is, of course, is that Singapore actually implemented it, whereas the United Kingdom did not. And why did the United Kingdom not implement it? First off, because of the fact that feckless politicians, as described earlier, but also because of the fact of insufficient funding, because the United Kingdom's response to the 2008 economic crisis was to enact massive cuts across the board so as to avoid having a rising level of debt, which involved massive cuts to the kind of programs that should have actually been in place for a pandemic. So when the pandemic actually did come, when ground zero was detected in China and it was detected that China had not reacted within the 3-week window with as much speed as should have been, and they ended up having to play catch up inside of their own country as a consequence of that, despite having had 3 weeks to see China bungle their initial response, the United Kingdom still basically just sat there and let itself be hit. That's that should be almost unforgivable. The political class allowed that to happen, and then they waffled about it for the next 2 to 3 months. By the time it reached July, there were still conversations about, oh, should we have track and trace? Track and trace was not even implemented properly until September. That was like 9 months after ground zero.
But that's, again, if it were a criticism of liberalism across the board, then we would expect to see all liberal countries bungle it. But then why did South Korea handle it properly? They're a liberal democracy just like the United Kingdom.
Well, I like to refer to South Korea sometimes as a quote-unquote liberal democracy because of the fact that even though they operate this branding of we are a liberal democracy, the extent to which they prioritize the individual over the collective is such that they may have the liberal institutions, but the way of thought behind how they're making their decisions does not hinge around like, how can I maximize individual liberty? I mean, South Korea is a place that does like what do you call that? SNI inspection, where basically like if you go to certain websites or whatever, the government has like entire systems that like intervene to present you with reasons as to why you can't browse there and stuff like this. I mean, South Korea has a lively debate apparently going on right now about should there be, what do you call that thing? The unconditional basic income. And stuff like this. Like they're having conversations that you ordinarily would not be able to have in the United States. So I would not consider South Korea to be like a mini clone of United States or a mini clone of United Kingdom in terms of the way that they understand how quote unquote democracy is supposed to work.
But UBI
different conclusions. Right?
Yeah, UBI or its variants. Like I support a negative income tax. Milton Friedman supported a negative income tax. That's not incompatible with liberal capitalism. In fact, I would go so far as to say we're in the infancy of capitalism. We're still in kind of that industrial revolution free for all kind of thing. And that if we want to move out of early stage capitalism into like toddlership, or even, youth capitalism, we need to have a basic income and a basic safety net, a negative income tax system, such that we can embolden and bolster the capitalist project. I think we're in a very early and primitive stage of capitalism. I see basic income. Now, I'm not for UBI. I don't think Bill Gates should be getting $1,000 a month. I'm for negative income tax, but that's not incompatible. Like that's almost like saying Obama's a socialist, Obama's a communist.
Indeed. Because it was Milton Friedman who actually proposed the negative income tax, was it?
Yes, it was. So I'm a liberal in the tradition of Milton Friedman in many ways in that sense. And he basically pointed out, like, look, you can't have no safety net. And he was a lot more of a libertarian than I am. And even he was like, we need to have, like, he it was the sort of thing that to just say, like, when we talk about liberalism, laissez-faire capitalism is a type of liberalism, but so is social democracy.
Indeed.
So is social democracy. I'm somewhere in between them. I'm more towards laissez-faire, but again, I'm the guy who supports negative income tax and what I would kind of term a compassionate conservative approach to liberal economics. So that's kind of my
okay. So I mean, I wasn't fully expecting that you would basically just come out and agree with that out of the gate. But I mean, I guess that is something we actually agree on. That if we're gonna operate a system of liberal democracy, even if there are aspects of it we don't like, it would be nice to have a negative income tax implemented in that, because then
necessary. Otherwise, you allow communists to fester because of they saying, oh, or they'll say, oh, we're in the infancy. Well, they'll call it late stage capitalism, which is stupid because they basically term what I call the infancy of capitalism. They call it late stage capitalism because they see all these failings, whereas I attribute those failings to the infancy, to the early youth of capitalism. The growing pains.
This is exactly the next point that I was going to bring up, actually, which is that, I mean, obviously you believe this, but do you believe that the rest of the system believes what you believe on this? So, for example, if you were to say that, well, you think this is only early days for capitalism as opposed to late stage, like if you were to have a conversation with, say, I don't know, let's just take a slice of people in American Congress, for example. Bear in mind, these are the same people who had to be like hand wrung just the other day just to get 600 quid a week to the individual constituents that they're responsible for. Like, if you were to come to them and say the only way to stabilize this system and prevent the radical left from using arguments to undermine the system, i.e. arguments such as the politicians don't care about you. If you were to come to them and say the only way to stop that is to actually preemptively say, well, actually, we do care, and here is how we care, and we're going to provide actual material benefit to the citizens during a time of crisis that will be sufficient to take them out of the gigantic debt that they've all slid into over the past 12 months. Because, of course, many of the working class people in the US are now in massive debt as a consequence and can't pay their rent and stuff like this. Now, of course...
Well, that went before the virus. The debt problem, I talk about that in this channel all the time, just so that people are aware. I'm more radical than Dave Ramsey on debt. I want to abolish corporate, household, and national debt, and not in the sense of nobody owes anything anymore. It needs to be paid back. But I want to ban usury. Like, I don't believe in usury, for example. So
yeah, and I mean. People could explore that, and I mean, I understand the sentiment is respectable, but I mean, would you acknowledge that the system is unlikely to agree with you on that?
Yeah, that's why I'm not a neoliberal.
That doesn't mean that means that they just disagree with you and me.
No. But like, I did a degree in economics, and almost everybody in my program was either a flaming neoliberal or like a communist who was just studying it because they wanted to like prove Marx right or whatever. I'm neither. I'm like a conservative capitalist in the sense that I want to go back to the old days where we understand that, you have to have money to pay for stuff, and you can't just borrow. Like, I don't like this rent type economy that we have right now where everybody just borrows money for everything and never owns anything. And then after they're done paying off like a 2-year cell phone plan, they do another 2 years and so on and so forth. So nobody ever really owns anything. We basically have two middle classes in America, where there's one middle class that actually owns their assets even though they're not rich or anything, and then there's another middle class that's actually poor, but they are able to live a middle class lifestyle because their purchasing power is artificially and social constructively increased by the debt economy. The debt economy is a national security crisis. I did a video very recently called "We Need to Have a 1-Year Emergency Fund." That doesn't mean we borrow money for a year like Canada and the US are doing right now, where we borrow half of our GDP to get through this crisis. It means Western countries need trillion-dollar sovereign wealth funds that are only used in extreme circumstances like we're seeing right now. That's my view on it. So I'm not a neoliberal.
Has talked about this as well, that he views that if Western countries had sovereign wealth funds, it would fundamentally alter the way in which they do politics.
Well, Norway does. I like Norway. I wish we would act more like Norway in a lot of areas, because Norway, they're totally fine with drilling oil. They actually have a lot fewer regulations than the United States does. And yeah, they have a bit higher of a tax rate. I'm not so much for higher taxes in theory, but we need to clear out the debt and we need to have a strong military. So in practice, for the next few decades, we're going to have, similar taxes to what we do now if I'm in charge. But when it comes to sovereign wealth funds are the same as if you're a household and you have a 6-month emergency fund versus you are living paycheck to paycheck. That's basically it on a national level. And we can't do it because our leaders are addicted to the debt. They're addicted to this usury sponsored increase of purchasing power. They're addicted to this leverage that gives them this idea of, oh, well, we have more money because we can just borrow it, bro, and all this kind of thing. I I don't like that at all. We need to pay off our debt. We need to basically have constitutional amendments that will prohibit, just outlaw governments, parliaments, Congress from going into debt in the future. Everything has to be balanced or produce a surplus. That would be awesome. And we need to allocate 5 to 10% of spending each year up until we're fully funded at a 1-year sovereign wealth fund that can only be used if it is voted such that we have a crisis. In other words, you could say maybe it's an executive order, maybe it's the president, the executive branch that determines it, or maybe it's the parliament or the Congress that determines it. But yeah, so when you talk about how you're anti-liberal, when you talk about you talk about how you're anti-liberal and how you point to these problems in liberalism, I'm trying to fix some of the weaknesses of liberalism to strengthen the West. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. What I guess my question for you, Ray, would be, why, in the face of these problems that we can work out within our system, why do you oppose improving our civilization, just outright identify as anti-liberal? I don't understand that.
Well, the reason that I'm saying that is because many of the things that you have mentioned in this very live stream, in the cases where we have agreed with each other on certain things, you say that you are improving the presently existing system. However, I would point out to you that in order to enact the improvements that you're talking about, you would have to undermine fundamental tenets that people in Western liberal society have come to see as normal. Like when you fundamentally change something like that, you are telling people that this is not how it works anymore, right? So, for example, this idea of a sovereign wealth fund sounds all well and good. In fact, I think, and I agree with you, that sovereign wealth funds should be created everywhere. They're fantastic. Okay. You could actually have the negative income tax. We agree on that. Both of us have actually advocated for that for quite a while. I don't know how long you've advocated for it, but we've probably advocated for about the same length of time, right? So we're in agreement on those things. It's just that the method that one would have to take in order to get there, I don't think you'll be able to come out and say, okay, well, we're going to do this because we believe in liberal individualism and the Enlightenment, and so therefore we can somehow get a liberal system to just implement these things for us. I have a feeling that in order to do so, any movement that would implement that would have to be at some point non-liberal.
What do you mean by non-liberal? Like, would you call Reagan non-liberal? Because he increased defense spending to 8%. And a lot of people said, hey, look, we want lower taxes. What are you doing? Because right now, America only spends about 2.3% on the military. He spent 8% to fight the Soviets, but he did it to defend the liberal order. Would you call him illiberal because he was a social conservative?
No. I would group him under liberalism there. But okay. What I'm talking about is things that fundamentally alter the way in which society is viewed in the first place. So, I mean, if you're going to set up a sovereign wealth fund and if you're going to have a negative income tax for everyone, you're then proceeding on a philosophical assumption that everyone in the country has a group identification with each other. You would have to in order to be able to articulate the desire to have this thing in a way that would have popular support for it. In order to get popular support behind these things, you have to end up saying a bunch of stuff that's non-liberal.
No, but that's not true, because if you look at the welfare system that we have right now, negative income tax would replace the welfare system. In other words, the same amount of people that receive welfare, not that much, would now receive negative income tax, and it would get rid of the bureaucracy. It wouldn't be everybody gets money from the government now. It would be, it's a safety net for those who need it so that they can get back on their feet. That would be the understanding. It would still fundamentally be a liberal understanding. All of the Western democracies actually have some form of welfare statism. They're just inefficient and bureaucratic and whatnot. A negative income tax would remove that bureaucracy.
But you have to take into consideration that the inefficiency in the bureaucracy, particularly with the means testing element in all of this, because that's where most of the bureaucracy comes from, right? The means testing. The legacy of means testing. Now, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but again, maybe I'm viewing this through a very sort of British Commonwealth lens, which I acknowledge I have that bias sometimes when I'm looking at the way that liberalism operates. But as far as I understand it, the first implementation of this means testing welfare state thing was out of the Irish famine, where British liberals decided that rather than just having the system bail out everyone who needed it at any given time and just let it happen. They wanted to make sure that everyone who passed through the so-called poorhouse was vetted to make sure that they were earning under a certain amount of money before they would be eligible for the bailout. And so in the process of doing so, they ended up actually reducing the wealth of the middle class, because you had to be already broke in order to get the assistance. But if you weren't already broke, then you couldn't get the assistance and you would then become broke. Right.
Yeah,
but
with
this is something that has
income
its
tax,
roots in the sort of liberal ideology of the 19th century. So if you come now and say that, well, actually, we think that every person in the entire country should have the ability to automatically be bailed out because of the negative income tax,
that's not true.
You're undermining some of the roots of what liberalism put in place initially.
But that's not true. That's not true. The negative income tax would apply to like less than 5% of people. Most, like, it's not like if you're on negative income tax, you get a Ferrari. No, it's like $20,000 a year or whatever. It's like you want to get out of it. And it's the sort of thing that, but we say, though, there is a safety net. In other words, for our system to function successfully. I mean, my friend Wyatt said it very well. He said, and he's a really conservative guy, but he said, look, a government can't function for like a 96-year-old lady that basically relies on her pension or whatever, then government doesn't really function for anybody. And that is not, like, again, I think you're conflating laissez-faire economics with liberalism in general, whereas Denmark and Norway are just as liberal as America and South Korea are. They're different versions of the liberal project, but at the end of the day, the fundamentals are all very, very similar. We just have different tax rates and different sizes of government, but we all have the human rights. We all have fair constitutions. We all have this understanding of individual dignity and autonomy. We just have slightly different takes on it. But again, I don't see how even welfare statism. I know that some people at PragerU, for example, might say that welfare is communist. I'm against the welfare system. I want to replace it, but I'm not going to call, say, Elizabeth Warren a communist. She's a liberal too. She just happens to be a very social democratic liberal, and I happen to be more of a center right sort of liberal, more in the Friedman sort of school on that. But we're still both on the same side in that sense when it relates to economics. I don't understand this idea that in order to do a slight reform of the liberal system in America, but still be liberal, we would therefore have to become totally collectivist or totally fascist or totally communist or whatever, or totally illiberal. I don't really understand that. And now the point that you were getting at, which is that it would have to be touted from a position of, I guess, populism or something. Maybe,
yeah, you would end up having to do things that will violate liberalism in order to get the changes that you wanted done. That's what I'm trying to highlight. But
populism is so vague, and it can be construed as for high taxes or for low taxes. Both Trump and Bernie marketing themselves as populists. But at the end of the day, though, to market something in a particular way. So, for example, I'm a protectionist. That's still in the context of liberalism. I don't want to trade with my enemies. Sure. I want to make stuff here. Some people might say that that's socialism or whatever. I don't really care. Those people are radical ANCAPs.
But I mean, let's take a recent example then. I mean, this COVID-19 bill, the COVID-19 so-called relief bill that is basically going to pass, right? I mean, I may have this wrong because, again, this is a fast-moving thing, so maybe these things change in situ, so I guess people can correct me in the chat if I'm wrong. I'm pretty sure that the COVID-19 relief bill, in all of its like complete ridiculousness, right, that's going to pass like 98-2, isn't it? The Senate, that is. It's going to pass the Senate 98-2 or something like this, isn't it?
Okay.
Is it? Am I wrong?
Well, it's likely going to pass. I couldn't tell you the exact margin on that. I know that there's going to be
enormous, right? It's not going to be near the wire or anything. It's going to be
no. It's going to go through. Again, I don't see how emergency aid is somehow illiberal. I think it's
no. You're anticipating, but that's not what I'm going to say. I'm pointing out that the inadequacy of what they're actually providing there, which is basically this $600 thing that everyone that I'm seeing on social media and everyone across, the news websites and so on, all of them are complaining about this because nobody likes it. And yet the entire system seems to be unified behind pushing that particular bill in its particular form through anyway, with the exception of like, I guess, 2 senators, right? How would you propose that this system is going to be reformed from the inside by simply conforming to the existing ideals of the system, when overwhelmingly this system seems to be determined to not be reformed. That's how I put it to you. Like, how are you going to say? I mean, I understand what you were saying earlier, and I don't disagree with the principles that you are talking about, in the sense that you would want to have a negative income tax, you want to have, you know, these social systems. I don't disagree with what Wyatt said, which is that if the system can't provide for a 97-year-old woman, for example, then is the system truly functional, etc., etc. Right? I think some people in the chat may have misunderstood why I was raising these issues. It's not because I'm on the side of having means testing. It's because I'm simply saying I too think that means testing is a bad idea. It's just that I don't think a reform of the present system, where you nicely ask liberalism to reform itself, is going to result in you actually getting that.
Wait,
particularly since Congress is determined to not give you any of these things.
No, but nicely asked liberalism. Liberalism isn't some like monolithic god that like the people in the Congress.
You know what I mean, though, is in playing.
I know what you mean, but it's a bad phrasing of it. Here's the problem. Okay, I support what I want coming up after Obama, or after Biden gets his one term. I want the neoconservative renaissance to come in, where we get tough on the national security front, where we have I'll say a revision of the social contract, which it will strengthen the liberal project in the long run. I'm not a fan of Nancy Pelosi. Okay, like I'm not a fan of a lot of these politicians that are happen to be in the Congress in the United States right now. I think that they are eventually going to have to either be replaced, or they'll snap out of their delusion of keeping the trade going with communist China. I think it's very possible that we'll go back to the old status quo. That is a pathetic weakness on the part of particular leaders. That doesn't mean that we throw the system out, because this is the same system that gave rise to people such as John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, Harry Truman, for example, people that did extremely drastic things. I mean, the Marshall Plan as an example. I support a Marshall Plan in India. I support a Marshall Plan in Latin America, for example. I think the Marshall Plan, people could say, well, that's illiberal or whatever. It's like, no, that was instrumental in helping the liberal world defeat the evil empire. So again, we need to understand that we're not in a globalized world where America controls everything. And until we're in that world where the liberal world is the world, where the West is the world, where there's no more West or East, it's just a liberal set of democracies. Until we're there, we need to actually have, some pills from Machiavelli going down our throat, because Machiavelli was saying, you gotta be flexible. You can't be rigid in times of crises. And I think that's
really the goal, though. Is the goal really to make the West the entire world? Because I mean, this seems to be also part of a root of a problem here. That if you think that the entire world needs to become the West, then you've essentially set yourself a goal that leads to, possibly bad things happening.
Bad things happening? What do you mean?
You're biting off more than you can possibly ever chew. Like, it's one of those things where, like, how can you possibly say that you can get all cultures to conform to the Western conception of how to be in the world?
Hold on a second. I'm a moral universalist, so I believe that, like, I don't just believe it, like, I know that our system is the best of the available alternatives, and so you're basically making the point here that we should just have a world divided between continents of slavery and islands of freedom. Why not have the world be?
Are we going to say that every single civilization that disagrees with the ideas that came out of northwestern Europe is a continent of slavery, though? I mean, I'm not saying that there is no such thing as a continent of slavery, because of course there are plenty of ideas that exist and civilizations that exist in the world which are actually terrible ones, right? I mean, we both agree on that. I'm just not willing to go to the extent to say that everything that is not northwestern Europe is bad.
It's not northwestern Europe. These ideas, yes, they were largely pioneered by Enlightenment thinkers that happened to live in Western Europe, that just could have easily, in a different universe, come out of, say, Southern Korea or Western Africa. It's irrelevant. The ideas matter, and those ideas are not Northwestern or Northern European ideas. Those ideas are the ideals of humanity. I mean, the Enlightenment is something that all humans are entitled to. And we, as the vanguard of liberty in our movement here at this channel, as well as with my associates and whatnot, what we're trying to do is bring about a world which is hegemonic, which is unipolar, which is secure, which is prosperous, which is peaceful, in which there are no more gulags, there's no more Westphalian understanding of, oh, my sovereignty. No, you can forfeit your sovereignty. We have an international order, which is one, it is characterized by the center of gravity in Washington. Two, it is liberal. Three, it is Western, but not Western in the sense of Western Europe or whatever. I mean, the whole world is just the West. And three, all humans have equal dignity, autonomy, and we understand that these cultures that deprive that are not just lesser, not just inferior, but they need to be eradicated. And I will invoke
That
Christopher Hitchens here. I will invoke Christopher Hitchens here, who said, look, you might say, well, how can you go after Saddam when you're propping up this dictator over here? And he said, mark my words, in due time we will come for all of them. Now I'll add on Jean Kirkpatrick to that, which is that some of them can reform. We'll give them the option to reform. But if they don't reform, we're coming for them, and they will be neutralized, and we will destroy them. So,
well, look, here's the problem. I don't understand why people would think it would be desirable to have the entire planet be basically aligned behind. I mean, when I said earlier that this was Northwestern Europe, I don't mean that like in just purely a territorial sense, obviously, because the United States is not part of Northwestern Europe, and yet it has, obviously, it is the bastion of liberal thought at the present moment, right? What I mean when I say that is that there are particular historical conditions which made it possible for the people of Northwestern Europe to arrive at particular conclusions about how society should be organized, that have historical overhang that makes this, quote, natural for them, whereas not so natural for others. Earlier, you invoked South Korea when you were making your comparison and saying that, oh, well, there's liberalism in South Korea as well. But I mean, I would challenge anyone to essentially put American speechification or Northwestern European speeches about democracy or about government in general, like when people are making their highest speeches, like the kind of speech that you would see from John F. Kennedy, for example, or the kind of speech you would see from George W. Bush, or perhaps even the kind of speech you'd see from Lyndon Johnson. Now, I'm not saying that these people are bad, right? Because obviously I appreciate them for what they are. However, if you were to put these side by side with, say, speeches from people made just recently, perhaps in South Korea, you would find that South Korea plays on some keywords that are markedly different from the ones that you hear in the West. So, for example, in the West, you'll often hear phrases like individual, dignity, individualism, choice, etc., etc. There are if you were to make a bubble word cloud of like things that appear in South Korean speeches, you would see almost near the top would be blood and bone. Now, why would that appear if they have the exact same understanding of the world as their liberal sponsors do? They clearly do not. The way that they're articulating their political thought is that first they look to their own people as being equivalent to their family, members of their own ethnic group, which is why every single time they get really animated on a particular issue, the first thing they hark back to is this blood and bone phrase that keeps popping up in all of these speeches.
Right, that's reactionary, though. Let's just be clear about that.
And so eventually you're going to get to the point where if you wanted to export your Western conception of how politics works to the entirety of the planet, eventually you will bump into your own allies who don't actually agree with you on the individual being above the group, and you're going to have a site of tension and a conflict there. What I'm saying is that in these cases where these people disagree or they have a different way of understanding how society is ordered, insofar as they are not harming you, you could just leave them to that. Like, why would you? Like, why is it the West's mission to go in and tell people they have to be individualists? Why is that their mission?
Let's just leave Pinochet in charge. Let's just not pressure him to reform or anything. Let's just say, oh, that's your sovereignty, bro. No. What you're getting at here is this idea that the individualist understanding and the collectivist understanding can just coexist peacefully with each other, as if to imply that they're just moral equals and whatnot. No, let me just come out here and say, the most blatant example of this would be North Korea, where it's proof positive of my argument that collectivism is just individualism, where all the people work for one individual. And that, now that's obviously South Korea is not a tyranny or anything, but at the end of the day, collectivist sort of understandings are essentially they're propaganda that props up a very authoritarian understanding of things, and that if offered in a blank slate, if you were about to be born and enter this world, and somebody comes to you and says, you can either be born in a collectivist society where you will serve the will of the leader so that they can have their swaggy Mercedes and stuff and their yachts, and you can toil the fields like in the Middle Ages and whatnot, even though they've got TVs in Pyongyang, or you can be born in a system like America where whether you're rich or poor, you've got equal dignity basically and autonomy, and you can make of your life what you will. Which would you rather be born in? Everybody would go with the Western model. And so this isn't some idea of, maybe we're not the best, maybe they're better than us or whatever. It's like, no, it's to invoke the sort of topical figure here. It's kind of like Santa Claus. Like Santa Claus is a neocon. He's got a list. He's got a list of who's naughty and a list of who's nice. He knows you've been naughty. He knows if you've been nice. He knows good. He knows bad. And you know what? If you're bad, you're getting coal. Actually, this year you're getting nukes. If you're the Ayatollah, that's a bit of a different thing. But no, we need to understand there's good and evil in the world, and collectivism at the end of the day is just it is simply a means of control so that an individual at the top can control everybody else. It's just it's the hyper manifestation. Collectivism is the hyper manifestation of individual prestige and power, whereas individualism, ironically, in a way, is actually better for the whole group, because even Donald Trump, even though he's got more wealth and more power than other people, he can't just arbitrarily say, "Oh, this is here, so we're just going to arrest everybody." This sort of thing. He can't do that. The collectivism is that primitivist, reactionary approach to understanding sociology, and it will, in time, I'm not saying you like invade everybody, but it will die out because the West is the best, right? That's not arguable. So
I mean, can you understand the perspective of the other side when you say those kind of things? They see that their society may be under threat because the thing that you call the authoritarian enforcement of the conformity, et cetera, I'm just extrapolating out there. The thing that you perceive as that may be in fact the glue that holds that society together and enables it to actually face down foreign threats. So, for example, if South Korea didn't believe in its own racialized ideology, how would it be able to declare North Korea to be illegitimate?
Hold on a second. So
South Korea's
I want to dissect what you just. I want to dissect what you just said there. So your argument was maybe you need that collective understanding to be the glue to bind a national security
and everything else, the whole society together.
But then why did America rise? Then why did America rise up and defeat the Soviet Union? America was an individualist country, yet they had figures such as Kennedy who said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. In other words, there were elements of what you might term to be collectivism, but that was patriotism. I want to be clear. There's a difference between patriotism and having a patriotic culture and having a collectivistic culture. Those are different things. I believe in patriotism. I believe that nationalism in that sense is good, But
I mean, my argument is that the reason why people who have a history that flows from Northwestern Europe are capable of doing that is because of the specific historical conditions which gave rise to them believing those things. But
those things are still the best.
But you can't just airdrop that into some place that never had that particular historical experience and has a different one and then expect it to actually work. Instead, you would just get the complete atomization and destruction of the society you think you are improving.
No. I'm not saying airdrop it. I'm saying it's a slow process. We're talking a project of decades, hundreds of years going forward to have the world. I mean, ideally by 23 to 2400, have the world basically be an American federation of democracies or just outright the United States. But that's a long project, but that is inevitably what will happen, because now, not necessarily that America's going to take over. I'm not deluded like that. I like Bob Kagan. He says, the jungle grows back. We could just as well have Russia run the world, if we give up. But there will be one hegemon that wins the world at the end of the day. That is going to be a thing, and they will force their way of life on everybody else. So I'm just saying that our way of life, our values are the most compatible with human dignity and interests. so we should propagate them throughout the world. And these arguments that you're making here, they sound very similar to the arguments that the CCP makes, where they say, oh, but the Chinese people have a different understanding. They don't want democracy. And it's like, who's saying that?
Sure
oh, the Communist Party thugs in Beijing. Oh, isn't that convenient?
I'm sure they would make a similar argument too, but I mean, many of your allies might make that argument. Right. This is what I'm saying. If you had this conversation, I'm sure that people in the Philippines or in South Korea or in Malaysia, et cetera, or Indonesia or so on would counter what you're saying by saying that, well, if you were to export that into their civil society, it would no longer be what it is anymore. Like it would be.
But that's good, because what it is right now is a patriarchal, primitivist, reactionary system in which women often don't have any autonomy. Now, I'm not talking about South Korea here. South Korea is way different, but there are different gradations of this very authoritarian and patriarchal understanding of social order, which deprives people of their liberty and their autonomy. But people, at the end of the day, are people, and they have human nature. And it's kind of, to use an extreme example here, it's kind of like when the leaders of Iran say, oh, there are no gay people in our country. Our country does not believe in gay values or whatever. And it's like, at the end of the day, they have the same proportion of gay people as we do. So why not just acknowledge people's autonomy and their dignity and have an individualist liberal system, as opposed to, oh, but you don't understand, man, if you forced liberal democracy, if you forced liberalism on, I don't know, let's say, for example, Iran, that would mean that the Iranian theocracy would fall apart. And I'm like, and here's where I come out and I do the John Bolton saying yes meme. I'd just be, yes. Like, yes, I'm guilty as charged. I'm a neocon ghoul. I want the world to be the best. I want the best system to prevail. So,
but I mean, at the same time, this gets modulated by the near-term national security interests of the U.S., which then creates what seems to be contradictions. So I'll give you an example. And again, I'm not the one making the argument. I'm just pointing out that people will credibly make this argument.
Yeah, those people are brainless.
You want to atomize the Iranian society so as to reduce the influence of the Iranian mullahs and thus destroy their ability to export terror around the world, etc. I mean, that's very nice and sounds laudable in the sense that even if you're not a person who likes individualism, you would like to see the Iranian mullahs no longer having any power. Okay. So you might conditionally support that. For example, I might conditionally support that and say, okay, well, yeah, maybe the Republic of Iran as it presently exists needs to be completely overturned because of the fact that its human rights abuses are beyond comprehension. Right?
Okay.
So, I mean, if individualism becomes a tool to make it so they can't manage that any longer, interesting, right? However, let's say that you have a place in which that kind of patriarchal domination does not exist, but they just happen to be not a friend of the United States. You guys still atomize and destroy that too, though.
Well, hold on a second. Let's just go through this step by step. So on the point about Iran, I'm not saying airdrop in where you just snap your fingers and all of a sudden we say we're doing liberal democracy and stuff now. What I would do to transition Iran is obviously do the incursion and everything, because they're about to get nukes and they need to be neutralized as soon as possible, preferably before January. But I would put the Shah in and then have the Shah over 30 to 40 years act as a benevolent dictator to oversee the transition process to lead the country towards a constitutional monarchy, where in 50 years they basically look like the United Kingdom is from now. And that's an improvement over what we have now. And they're an ally the whole way through, from being a dictatorship monarchy to being a constitutional monarchy with freedom and liberty for all. And so that's my sort of process there. And people can say, oh, that's a contradiction. Tell that to Jean Kirkpatrick. You have to work with bad actors to win. Okay. If we're not willing to do that, we will lose. We can't be paralyzed by idealism. No, and to your second point, but to your second point, where you said the second point there, after Iran, you had also talked about, well, what happens if there's a society out there that isn't as pernicious as you were describing, but they happen to be against American interests? I would like an example, but I will say this right now. America is the vanguard of liberty, and if you oppose America, you are inherently opposing the liberal project, because at the end of the day, there are either going to be Russia, China, or America winning the world. Those are your three options. Norway, they ain't going to be the world hegemon. Ain't going to happen. You can say, I like Norway more than America. That's cool. Maybe you're more of a social democrat. That's cool. That's cool. Understand you're better off advocating for social democracy in America, because America has a chance at global hegemony. We have to have a hegemonic world. That is the end state of humanity, whether it takes 50 years or 5,000 years, a world war, 8 world wars. That is the inevitable steady state of humanity for posterity.
Okay, well,
but what's your example? What's your example of a society that's harmless and benign in their cultural rejection of liberalism, but or whatever? But they're harmless, bro. They just happen to be against America. What example are you thinking of? South Korea?
Okay, no. The first thing I'll do is I need to obviously put a bookmark on the thing you said about the steady state of humanity being a single world hegemon, because I'm not sure that's ever actually endured for long enough for that to be the case. Like, if we look back through history, no one has ever actually had that for more than the fact that the United States had it after 1945 is kind of like an anomaly in world history, not the steady state of normality.
They didn't have it. That was not a steady state. America was rivaled by the U.S.
Not 1945, 1989, I should say, when the U.S. almost had it, because they still didn't at that point, obviously, because Iran still existed and so on, right? But I mean, the fact that the United States is as close as it is now to achieving it, that's an anomaly in human history. That's not something that happens normally.
No. The U.S. is nowhere near close. We got an ascendant Russia and China and North Korea and Iran, which all must be neutralized. So we're far away from it. 1989 was as close as there ever was, and then we had the weak neoliberal establishment that came in. But if we had Churchill come in 1989, he would have nuked the crap out of North Korea, and he would have bombed Iran, and he would have basically won the world forever. There never would have been another war again after that. So.
I mean, I would not be so sure that the response would be as simple as that. But
I'm just simplifying it. But my point is, it only takes a few purposeful wars in quick succession to win the world. Because at that point, all the other enemies know they better bow down and reform. Otherwise, they're next on the chopping block. Because if I was in charge, everybody knows the nukes are up for game right now, so they would get in line. So.
Well, the original question I was supposed to answer, though, I wasn't going to say that the group that I was going to talk about was going to be entirely benign. I was just talking about a group of people who don't have the same level of egregious top-down behavior against their own society, and who perhaps may not be aligned with you, but who nevertheless end up coming under the target of the United States despite this.
Okay, so, but who's your example?
After September the 11th, 2001, you know what Syria's relationship with the United States was, which is they were half on, half off, in the sense that they were doing some things that the United States did not like, and they were doing some things that you did like, which was handing over certain Al-Qaeda terrorists to the United States and so on. By the time of 2003, Syria decided to opt out of entering any kind of situation where it would try to defend Iraq from you. It chose instead to do this kind of weird half on again, half off, where they wouldn't actually support Iraq, but at the same time, if Iraqi soldiers or groups entered Syria, they would just pretend they didn't see it, right? So there was that whole thing that went on. Okay. So I get that there's an element of treachery, quote unquote, involved in Syria's behavior. Then, as things continued to progress, there were conversations between American officials and the Syrians about whether there would ever be a future situation in which the European Union would enter a positive trade relationship with Syria, which at the time was seen by European officials as being a way of trying to wean Syria off of their disastrous Russian dependency.
Okay.
Right? Now we look at Syrian society. Syrian society was nominally secular, even though there was obviously a domination of one particular group, which were the Alawites, who were nominally allied with the Shia and therefore had a positive relationship with Iran. So
they were never secular. Let's just be clear.
Why did the United States, particularly liberals who believed in responsibility to protect, so this is the most liberal of the liberals at this point, under Obama, for goodness sake, why did they arrive at the conclusion in the Arab Spring that rather than continue down this path of attempting to gradually turn Syria in the particular direction that they wanted, that they would instead just burn the house or assist random individuals who were possibly maybe not terrorists or possibly actually terrorists in burning the house down? This seems to be very. I mean, what is your view on that?
Wait, are we seriously going with the partisan girl direction here of basically accusing the opposition of Bashar the Butcher of being terrorists? I mean,
no. What I'm doing is I'm pointing out that the thing that you just said about the approach that you would take toward Iran, that because Iran is basically beyond reform and bad behaved, and they have a very rigid top-down structure which is unamenable to being turned.
Iran's different. Iran's different. Iran has to be neutralized because they're trying to get nukes. I just want to be very clear here. There might have been a project where you try to reform or foment an insurrection within and stuff before. they're a month away possibly from getting nukes. They have to be bombed immediately. We don't have a choice. That's different. That's different. If you're about to get nukes, you get destroyed. Like if you're going to pursue nukes.
But the thing that I'm proposing here is what is your view on why Syria became such an urgent threat, given that many efforts were being made to actually turn them in a particular direction? Like a lot of people are saying, oh, well, it's because Syria was a dictatorship. Well, I mean, almost everything in that region seems like it's a little bit of a dictatorship. So like, why was that one out of the others chosen when you could have actually weaned them off of Russia instead of actually driving them deeper into the arms of Russia, which is what ended up happening?
But that's a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the Ba'athist system of Hafez al-Assad as well as Bashar the Butcher. And basically these guys, their system was inevitably going to give rise to what wound up happening in 2011. That was always an unstable system. One of the arguments that people will make to me is they'll say, well, dictators like Saddam or Assad is the most stable system you can have, even if you prefer democracy or whatever. And I'm like, no, they're very prone to having revolutions. I mean, look at Bashar the Butcher's mismanagement of, of managing the country. I mean, he failed on the Machiavelli thing, because I talked about democracy needs to think like a dictatorship in a time of crisis. Bashar, he did the opposite. He's a dictator who was incapable of thinking like a democrat when the people were just demanding food. This whole thing basically started over food because the socialist system he had going was just so piss poor, incapable of even managing their agricultural.
A lot of people assess that in the other direction, which is that it so happened that a drought had happened at the exact time that they were relaxing many of the regulatory strictures that were previously on the Syrian economy. Because think about it, Syrians had only recently gained like full access to a reasonably unfettered internet. That was something that was new at the time period, right? For them, at least.
Okay. I just want to know your example of not harmless, but your example of just a culture or a country that's just doing things a bit differently, but happens to be anti-American, is an example of how can you be against them. Is Syria? Is the Syrian dictatorship? I thought you were going to go with a democracy like Japan or South Korea for your point. You're going with Syria?
No, because that would be an ally.
I'm the one here that argues that Syria should have been toppled way before 2011. I mean, this should have been done in the 80s. I mean...
No, that means you and Dick Cheney would disagree with each other then, because when Dick Cheney was asked about the issue with Syria, this was in, I think, was it 2004, 2003 or something?
Yeah, I'm not
had a conversation with him about Syria, and Dick Cheney was like, "Yeah, we're not doing that."
Yeah, no. I'm hockier than Dick Cheney. I'm not Dick Cheney. I'm not John Bolton. I'm not. I like those guys. Those guys are awesome, but those guys have some blind spots. So I'm not him.
Guys, it's we're over 2 hours, and not that we had a time limit or anything. I'm just letting you know. For your own sanity.
We should do another intermission.
Okay. Did y'all have? Was there any amount of time you guys wanted to go for? Or?
Let's go for half an hour more. I think there's just so much to get into.
Yeah, I mean, you guys are really. I didn't want to interrupt. You're right in the middle of it.
Even having to have like a second stream or something. But I mean, what's happened so far has actually been like pretty good in the sense that like we didn't like come on and just punch each other in the face or something.
I didn't think you would.
Are we like separated by such a gulf that we can't even talk anymore? But no,
it seems that we can actually. So, he was saying like, we have to have a moderator, otherwise it's gonna be crazy. I was like, no way, man. Like I didn't think, and I haven't had to do anything really. I was like, you guys will be fine. You've done before many times.
Have a moderator. I still support always having a moderator.
I don't think it's entirely necessary because like you guys have both been in like antagonistic conversations to like, and you're both really reasonable people. So I just didn't think like you guys know how to have a conversation. So you're not children. So
yeah, I think there are like at least some fundamental crossovers between us that make it so that it's not like blue alien is talking to orange alien or something, right? There's obviously some shared ideal somewhere between the two of us that enables us to like still have the conversation even when we disagree on certain things.
Right. Okay. So if you need a break, Kevin, and you want to do maybe 30 more minutes or so, I don't really know of another direction to take. I guess you can just pick back up where you guys had left off.
I think there's some more that's left on this idea of, I guess, moral or cultural relativism versus objectivism. I think that's kind of what we were getting.
I mean that's really interesting to me. It's I think that'd be cool for you guys to talk about. It kind of goes in a whole nother direction where you're talking about moral universalism or objectivism, or
Yeah, but I mean, liberalism does have a moral universalism that does seem to sometimes be built into it. Like I don't often see liberalism claiming that, okay, we want to have liberalism, but in this particular area of the world, and the others can figure it out.
Right.
Like
I'm
usually
a
they
moral
say, let's have it
universalist.
everywhere.
There was a
my
question.
my meme page is literally liberal hawk memes for moral universalist teens. Like I'm not one of those people who's like, maybe in this specific coordinates of the world, the laws of physics and what's right and wrong are different from here or there. No. I 100% I believe, you know, the values I care about here, where I am, you know, in basically in Canada, are just as valid, and people have just the same dignity if they're in northern Iraq, for example, or southern Sudan. So
yeah, I should say, oh yes, because Sudan was one I was going to bring up actually, but
we got to take an
when we
intermission.
get
I'll be
there-
back in a couple minutes.
I'll just say, just before we have the intermission, I was going to say the reason why I selected Syria and I did not select a country that is formally allied to the US at the present moment is because it would be kind of weird if I were to say that, okay, well, here's a country that's formally allied to the US who disagrees with you substantially on one thing. Obviously, the response to that would just be, well, the unification of foreign policy makes that happen, right? So I had to be very careful to choose one where the US and them do not actually share foreign policy interests either. So then that left me with pretty much Syria and what was it, 2 other countries that I could think of immediately. So
Libya, maybe
why.
Libya.
I mean, Libya would have been another one as well, where basically you could get them to do certain things for you, but they would not agree with you. So that would have been another one I would have chosen if I had to flip a coin on it.
Okay, so we'll be back in a couple minutes, I guess.
Okay.
And it looks like Kevin's just getting back. I don't know if Ray's back, maybe. Maybe not.
Are we back?
Oh, yeah, we're all back, it looks like. It's up to you guys. I don't know where you had left off exactly. I kind of had a question. I guess it could be for either of you. You were talking. I kind of had something. I had to go yell at my dog for a minute in the middle of your conversation. So there was one question. It was when you were talking about earlier. Do you think that there's like a distinction? I think Ray was sort of getting at something similar to this between like countries that are like the government is liberal, like they protect individual rights. They kind of have a liberal system, but they don't really have a liberal culture. That's to say that they kind of have a collectivist mindset, a collectivistic culture, especially if they have a shared. And like, I think the difference she was making between South Korea and America, it made sense to me because they have like a kind of historical like tie together more so than like Americans, where we'd come from all over the world and kind of made a nation out of nothing.
Exactly. This is something that Michael Hayden actually talked about in 2008 as well, when he had some gigantic speech he gave for explaining what the CIA's position, in his opinion, ought to have been on various issues related to the difference between the way the United States sees nationhood versus how other countries that the United States wants to assist or interact with see nationhood. And he had brought up that he had been going around in the Balkans, and he noticed that like no one in the Balkans, and I'm talking about US allies in the Balkans, no one in the Balkans actually like had the same view of what nationhood was about as the people who were working for him. And this created a lot of weird conversations where they would say one thing, and then the people in the Balkans who they are nominally trying to help would look at them like if aliens had just come from Mars to speak to them or something, right? So this is the thing that I was trying to highlight, which is that it is possible that you can have systems which are inherited from a liberal democratic framework. You can have a parliament. You can have a court, a judicial system which is modeled on the one that emerged from Western Europe, and so on. You can have these things, but if the individuals who are implementing these things aren't in that headspace, they're going to do dramatically different things from what you would have expected. And you can't. I don't think it would be reasonable to say that, okay, well, now your culture is invalid, we have to bulldoze it. I mean, I think that would be unreasonable to do that.
Okay, and I guess my question...
It harms national security, I would say. It would harm global security as well, because then it means you're creating conflicts where you didn't even have to have any.
Yeah, and I guess my question for Kevin then, like going off of that, and you guys can go back to talking about, I don't want to get in the middle of this or anything. It would just be like if you have a society like that, where the culture is kind of collectivist, but you have a government that is liberal and they protect individual rights, but the people are united, they're kind of cohesive, and they have a collective identity, sort of. Would that be the best of both worlds, or would the collectivism, even like a cultural kind of collectivism, have a downside to it?
So this question, just to understand, you're posing this to me specifically?
Oh yeah, because I think that Ray. I don't know. Maybe Ray would. I guess I could do it to both of you. It would be for you, Kevin. I guess it would be. Would the cultural kind of collectivism have a downside? And I guess for Ray, with the governmental, with liberalism side, where they're protecting individual rights, but they do have a cultural collectivist mentality. Would the governmental aspect of it, the kind of liberal government, be a problem for them as well? So either one of you can go first, or you guys can go back to talking about
No, I'll let Kevin go first. It's a good question, because this is where it was going anyway. So yes, I'll let Kevin answer first, though.
Okay, so yeah, I think it's a good question. I think that there are degrees of perniciousness to it. So obviously, I'm an individualist. I believe in the moral, I guess, supremacy of individualism at the end of the day. However, there's a difference between, say, where contemporary South Korea and contemporary Japan are right now, which they have collectivistic undertones, versus, say, for example, communist China, or a really good example of this would be North Korea. I think North Korea is like the epitome of the logical conclusion of collectivism, where, as I say, collectivism is nothing more than hyper-individualism, where the whole country serves one individual at the end of the day. And there are different understandings of that and different spectra of that. But that's really where it is. Whereas in individualism, the individual serves the individual instead of a bunch of individuals or a bunch of people serving one individual. But that system is still inherently an individualist system. It just places the great leaders as the individuals that matter. But I think that, and discards the rest, I think that to answer the question about, well, can you have a liberal sort of government overseeing a collectivistic sort of culture? I think, yes, I think that's a good thing. I think, for example, we could see that, for example, with the direction that was taken in Japan, as well as in South Korea, and to a lesser extent, you could talk about Chile, and you can talk about even Greece, for example. And the thing is, I think that having a U.S. dominated world in which the U.S. maintains states that are, could be considered authoritarian, and that have, say, authoritarian or collectivistic sort of cultures, that system, if we allow that system to go on for, say, 10,000 years, and you come back after 10,000 years, those countries that were basically client states, they'll look a lot more like America, and those cultures will look a lot more like America. I'm not saying that North Korea then would look like exactly like Wyoming, for example, but it would look a lot more like Wyoming with an American-run system than it would to what it is today. And that if you fast forward 152,000 years, it might look indistinguishable from the culture in Wyoming or in Florida, or by then what would be in Pakistan. They'd all look the same, and they'd all basically look like what we have today in the center of gravity of America. In other words, human rights, dignity, capitalism, freedom, all that good stuff. And so I think that it's a long-term process, and I don't think that you should just go to war with somebody just because they happen to have a different sort of culture than you. I'm not making that point here, and I think that it's a valid point to raise, or a valid question by Ray to raise. Well, aren't you just making conflicts where they don't need to arise? I'm not arguing for outright conflicts where there's not a security threat. What I'm arguing for is leverage and pressure that's applied, and that we, at least domestically at home, have the convictions to say we are the best, and we're not going to question ourselves the way that the academics like Noam Chomsky, the Snorren and Boren will do, where they say maybe we're the bad guys, or Edward Said, who says, but that's just their culture, bro. You don't understand. Brown people and despots, that's just their culture. And if you disagree, that you're an Orientalist, Western, white, trying to tell brown people that they can't be slaves of Saddam Hussein, bro. So I really do feel that when I say at the end of the day, again, I'm talking thousands, tens of thousands, 100,000 years down the road, we need to be moving towards that now. Because if we don't take serious moves in the next 10, 20 years to get our civilization back and neutralize those threats to us, the world in 100,000 years or in 10,000 years will be equally dominated by China or equally dominated by Russia. I want the world to be dominated by America for the rest of time. So that's my view.
Okay, well, I mean, I hear what you're saying on that. I mean, my response to it, I am more cautious on the issue of trying to fundamentally change the way that a culture organizes itself, because when I look back over like the past 1,000 years, much of which I haven't been alive for, obviously, but when I look back over the past 1,000 years, there are some things that have been a constant that just haven't changed. So if we take Afghanistan as a key example of stuff that just hasn't changed, when it's like high noon in Washington D.C., like in Kabul, it's still like the year 1680, and they're still having like implicitly a conversation over like, how should a country be governed if there's some people who are living in it who are Pashtuns, and then some other people who are living in it who are the descendants of Genghis Khan, who live in a place called Hazarajat, right, which is in the center of the country, and so on. So when people come in there and say, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're just going to gradually make them see that they're actually just individuals, bro, this then becomes problematic, because like everyone who has attempted to get them to do that before has failed. Like they know who they are, right? They're not going to suddenly just shake hands with each other and be like, yeah, we're just going to not kill each other anymore over these,
I'm not arguing
over these historical issues. Instead, what I say is that the best way to deal with these problems is to acknowledge that sometimes these guys just aren't going to do the thing that Europeans or Americans actually want them to do. And so maybe instead a solution needs to be crafted to just keep them from aggressing against each other by granting them space which is actually theirs, in which they can govern each other. And to the extent that we enforce things and that we understand sovereignty, we should say that these states or statelets or autonomous zones, if you want to call them that, whatever it is, they should have autonomy up to the point where they violate the UN Charter. So obviously, you should not just be allowing people to violate fundamental tenets of the UN Charter, but if they have alternate views on certain things that don't violate the UN Charter, then I don't think that the rest of the world should expend massive amounts of energy attempting to bend something that doesn't want to bend.
No, I really disagree with that last point, though. I'm not against, say, for example, countries seceding from one another to, like, so, for example, if the Kurds want to be their own state, I'm cool with that. What I want is just a Western world. That could be a Western world of one country, or 500 different countries that aren't at war and all share, you know, liberal capitalism and individual rights. They just happen to have their own governments and stuff. It's still America as the hegemon. That's cool. Either way, it doesn't really matter to me. But the point there about the UN Charter, no, the UN, here's one of the biggest misconceptions about the UN. The biggest misconception about the UN is that the UN was a good idea and it became corrupted over time from like bribes or lack of will to enforce the charter and that kind of stuff. No. Let's be real. From its inception, the UN was a compromise between good and evil, between the West and Stalinism. And the UN, in 100 years, in 10 years, in 50 years, I don't want the UN to be a thing. I want NATO to replace the UN as the institution for multilateral talks and all that kind of stuff. We don't need the UN. Russia, the Kremlin, their thugs, their view is irrelevant to me. I know what they're going to say. We don't need them.
Into NATO is the concept that it's literally called North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Right. But
how are you going to increase membership to include people who are not even in it?
No. But we could change the name of NATO to say the liberal order or the vanguard of freedom. We could call it whatever the hell we want. I'm fine with bringing Israel. I'm fine with bringing Australia. I'm fine with bringing Saudi Arabia into NATO. But I don't want us to have this idea where we say, oh, but we've got this UN charter. I don't believe in international law. International law is a social construct. I want to forge the world into our illustrious image as the West. That's what I want. I am a neocon, so... You know,
I mean, would you be against other regionalized groups that do not want to do that thing? So, for example, let's say that you have ASEAN, which is basically Southeast Asia, and well, ASEAN +3. So let's say you have Southeast Asia plus South Korea plus Japan, and obviously China's going to want to go on in there, which is why it's +3 and not +2. Let's say that they created over time through. You know how neo-functionalism works, which is if you trade with someone enough over time, they become codependent on you for their existence, which then leads to harmonization of trade and regulations and so on. Let's say that gives rise to the thing that people have been talking about at the highest level of APEC for a while, which is Free Trade Area of Asia Pacific. And then let's say that becomes kind of like a pseudo-political grouping. Would you acknowledge, or at least would you entertain the idea that Free Trade Area of Asia Pacific and whatever political grouping arises out of it, let's say it's in an East Asia community or something, quite similar to how the European Union arose out of the European Coal and Steel Pact.
Right.
If that happened, would you be willing to acknowledge that maybe the world would not be united and it's actually going to be a world of mega regions instead?
Well, no, that would inevitably lead to what we saw in World War I. They would eventually, maybe not today or tomorrow, but they would eventually have a nuclear war with each other or some kind of global conflict. That's what would happen. But I would view the emergence of that, if it's involving Beijing, as an inherent and existential threat to our security, and it should be nipped in the bud as soon as possible. I don't believe in free trade with China, for example. I think that we, as the West, we need to work together to bring a close cooperation between countries such as Australia, South Korea, Japan.
Before you go down that path, I should point out that in the game plan that had been spelled out, and obviously this is something that's been going on. I mean, this is something that had been discussed. I think that's the first time I recall Free Trade Area of Asia Pacific being mentioned was actually during the latter part of the W. Bush administration. But the whole point of Free Trade Area of Asia Pacific was not to have China enter it as a rule setter, but rather to enter it as a rule taker. In other words, we acknowledge from the outset that their way of understanding trade is actually not optimal. And so if you can actually convince them that they need to sign up to whatever it is we're doing, then you end up with a different result than if it were the other way around.
But Ray, you know as well as I do that China pursues a sub-optimization approach, which means they play by their rules and they join our institutions, but they still do what they're going to do, and we take it because we become dependent on them. In other words, they're the ones calling the shots, and our leaders are weak and feckless. So I'm against it. I think that idea that if we just talk to the bully and give the bully our lunch money, that they'll become a nice person and want to hang out with us. No, they'll still be the bully. They'll still take your lunch money, but now they'll have money and now they'll buy swag, bro. So you just...
No, but if they were to behave that way, the idea is that then they would have to suffer the obvious consequences of having been the actual defector. And the consequences in this case would be, let's say that they join RCEP, and let's say that they actually join the CPTPP, and then it rolls together and becomes free trade area of Asia Pacific as prophesied or whatever, right? Let's say that actually happens, because there's always a chance that it won't happen, right? But let's just hypothesize that it does happen. When they join that, it means that they've actually signed up to the idea there's an international arbitrator which cannot be from the country which is party to the dispute, meaning that if China commits some kind of like trade violations under this system, they would not be able to have the judge be a Chinese person who's going to rule in their favor. That would be impossible.
Okay.
Because it's
But
not allowed.
that's kind of like
So
the UN.
they would just lose every single one of the cases if they start violating the rules, right?
But that's kind of like the UN, where the UN will chastise, or they'll say, "Oh, you did a no-no." Like North Korea did a
economic
no-no.
consequences in this case, though, because if they're part of a trade agreement and they start violating the rules, then the consequences are literally economic.
But that sounds like liberal internationalist dreamland to me. That sounds like, oh, maybe if we all just talk and we all just trade with each other. I got news. There was a higher percentage of world GDP comprised of trade between countries in the run-up to World War I than there is today. And I'm not just talking about the pandemic. I mean, like in 2017, the world trade constituted a lower percentage of world GDP than in the run-up to World War I. Talking and trading with each other and stuff doesn't make the world more peaceful. What makes the world peaceful is one strong unipolar hegemon laying down the law, being the world police, enforcing its will and forging the world into its image. And that's the vanguard of liberty, and that's the America that I want to see. So
I would say that
that's how you have world peace.
I mean, I agree with you on that history that you have to take into account. But I would say you have to take into account the fact that everyone is also aware of this fact, which is that it's taken so long for the globalization process to actually bring global trade anywhere near to the level that it was approaching on the eve of the First World War, that leaders are aware of what they would be sacrificing if they were to repeat the First World War a second time.
But you think the leaders wanted the First World War? No. The First World War happened because of the nature of multipolarity. It was a tragedy of multipolarity. The First World War is an example of why America should have become a hegemon 100 years sooner, basically, and prevented the emergence of the world wars in the first place. The tragedy of multipolarity is this. It's that once you're there, even if you don't want to do war is inevitable, and it will happen, and it will draw you into it. America wanted to be isolationist, and America was drawn into the war anyway, both times, both World War I and World War II. Multipolarity is a recipe for endless world wars. People say, oh, the neocons want endless war. No. I want to win the wars very quickly. I want America to enforce her image on the entire world, and I want the rest of history to be devoid of war and suffering evermore thereafter.
Well, I mean,
that's what I want.
The other side would make a similar argument, which is that if you had multipolarity but codependence, then you're spending less money to get presumably a similar result, which is
that's not true. That's not true. There's no codependence. Codependence is a myth. Codependence is a myth because the leaders in Beijing always knew that they were playing us, and the neoliberal corporatist establishment here always thought in this short-term thing of, oh, it's free trade, bro. Maybe let's just be friends with them and ignore the long-term ramifications of literally enriching the enemy. Like this idea of gains from trade, yeah, guess what? There are relative gains. They gained more from the relationship than we did. We got played, and we should learn from that to never interact with our enemies and enrich them again. And we should treat them the way that we treated the Soviet Union, which is to say, you are out of the world economic order. You can have your own thing and whatnot, but we will seek your neutralization, and it will come about, and you will not be able to compete with us, and we will bury you, essentially. That's what needs to happen here. I want strong leadership in the West.
If they'd taken the hostile approach and said that, okay, the year is now 1989, and so now there's going to be like a pivot to China immediately. If they had done that, wouldn't China have just responded to this by investing in all the parts of the developing world that the West had already failed to develop? And then you'd have two giant competing camps. So you'd have Northwestern Europe, basically, and the United States and parts of Latin America. And then you'd have like China, parts of Southeast Asia, and practically the whole of sub-Saharan Africa on the other side.
Relative wealth. China was so much poorer than the combined GDPs of the West. The West could have so easily outplayed them in Africa and in the developing world. I mean, the third world, the developing world, could have been so won by
given the legacy of what had happened previously. Would it have played out that way though? Like, I mean, could you imagine the United Kingdom or the Netherlands or Germany taking like, quote, responsibility and actually developing the parts of Africa to prevent China from being there first?
Well, no. I'm not saying
proven they wouldn't do it, right?
I'm not saying altruism here. I'm not going to be naive or anything. They would be in there for national security reasons to oppose China. But I just want to be clear right now, are we trying to sanitize what China's doing in the developing developing world, because they're not out there the goodness of their hearts to spend their hard-earned
I'm not
money.
saying that they are either.
No. They're trying to get
we...
Africa, in particular, nations such as Kenya and Tanzania, into permanent debt so that they can enforce their communist way of life on them, because they'll build these stupid infrastructure projects that they don't even really need. It's just so that they can burden these get these corrupt politicians in Kenya and elsewhere to burden their people.
They don't need the infrastructure, though?
Well, no, they do need infrastructure, but let's be clear about something. This stuff, let's be clear. Sri Lanka, for example, China buying up $1 billion port, which is at the heart of the world, basically trade in terms of shipping. In Sri Lanka, they're doing that not out of the goodness of their hearts to raise the living standard of the Sri Lankans. They're doing it because they know that it benefits them in the long run, and the Sri Lankans have to pay them back for it. So I wish that we would wake up to what the Chinese are doing and say, no, that's our sphere of influence. We're going to be there. We're going to offer more money. We're going to get our guys over there, and they're going to serve our interests.
But can you imagine why there might be people in Sri Lanka or in the region at large who may look at that and say that, okay, up until the point where China entered that situation and began doing that stuff with ports, like almost 90% of loans that went to Sri Lanka came from Western international institutions and or the IMF, right? So suddenly now the alarm bells have gone off because China has shown up in the region, because the West believes that Sri Lanka should actually be the West's sphere of influence. I mean, if we look at the location of Sri Lanka...
Wait, no, the world is our sphere of influence. I want to be clear. I want a world that is the West. I don't say, oh, that's their sphere of influence. And no, everything is our sphere of influence in the long run. So every corner of the world deserves to be a part of the liberal project.
Okay, but I mean, can you understand why the elites in Sri Lanka may disagree very strongly with you when you say that? And why?
Yeah, because Chinese money talks. Chinese money talks. You know that.
Western money also talked. It just so happened that they decided to get some of both types of money, and now everyone is complaining.
Well, yeah, you can't see why we're complaining about it. Communist China's the enemy. Like, you'd complain about it too if you were representing Western interests here. So,
I mean, okay, what do you think that it is unreasonable that the Sri Lankan elites have done what they have done? Like, I mean, this is the thing that I want to get at. I mean, would you acknowledge at least that if you were the Sri Lankan elites, you would not have done differently from what they have presently done?
So to get to that question,
which is to basically dip into both money pools, which is what they have done.
No. I understand. I understand their specific interests. It's kind of the same reason why Israel. People have said to me, they're like, "Look at Israel. They're talking with Putin." I'm like, yeah, I don't really like that. But hey, look, if I was Netanyahu, I'd have to do that too, because look at how untrustworthy the West is being to secure Israeli interests. I mean, look at Obama, how much he betrayed Israel. I mean, yeah, now you could say Trump's done a really good job with Israel, but now Netanyahu knows, well, Biden might not, so we have to hedge our bets. I understand why they're doing it, and also corruption plays a big part into it. But you can point out that there's IMF corruption too. I'm not the biggest supporter of the IMF or anything. I understand that those debt traps existed under the IMF too. But if we're going to have debt traps in the developing world, they should be Western debt traps, not communist debt traps, at least, because we can move out of that in the long run. The thing is, the communist Chinese objective for Africa is to do to Africa basically what the West did to China, make them their low intensive, cheap product base of manufacturing, so that China can move into a higher material stage and be even richer, so that they can fund a bigger nuclear arsenal to effectively rival the United States. That's kind of their long run.
Okay, sure. But I mean, this is a slightly different topic, but I mean, by your own logic, does that not result in a wealth transfer happening between China and Africa, in which Africa will end up ultimately producing many of the sort of the basic lower tier industrial equipment, which then China becomes dependent on in order to actually do anything?
Well, not exactly, because China becomes China's China. But China doesn't have the same neoliberal establishment that we do, where their establishment over there, they'll pursue the same tactics as our neoliberals will in terms of free trade. But the difference is they enforce their ideological vision over it, whereas we don't. We just say, oh, we don't really care about like liberal democracy or making sure that our civilization prevails. We just care about profit, bro. Whereas for communist China, it's not just about profit for them. It's about power, and I wish it would go back to being about power for us as well, because we're getting taken to the cleaners. So,
well, I mean, you might be the first person who's actually made that specific argument to me specifically, claiming that China is actually seeking to spread a specific ideology through its engagements, because usually
they've always done that.
They're doing no strings attached, pure profiteering. That's
no,
usually the criticism that I get.
No. But communist China, even in the Mao days, was funding all kinds of communists in the developing world. They've always had this revolutionary.
Yes, during that time period when it was the competition between the Soviet Union and China for how the third world was going to be developed, there was a whole set of. I mean, studying Africa from that perspective in itself is almost like you could be there for years, right? Of the number of different groups that were all contesting against each other. Some of them Soviet aligned, some of them aligned with Maoist concepts, and so on. It's just that if we look at that in 2020, are they still doing that? It seems now as though you can get
they're funding the
China no matter what you're doing.
No, they're funding communists throughout the developing world. They're funding terrorist communists in India. They are working with Pakistan. What they're doing right now is, it might seem like they're just after a short-term profit or whatever. Mark my words, this is part of a long run. And when I say long run, I'm not talking 4 to 8 years like in America. It's a long run, century-long plan to take Eurasia and turn it red. And we're letting it happen because we're deluded. We're blinded by short-term election cycles, and it sucks. So I wish that we would get a broader understanding that say, if we want to actually preserve our civilization and our order into the long run, we need to understand that we're in an existential crisis right now, just as we were in 1957. And the good guys don't, it's not written in stone that the good guys win at the end of the day. Because if the good guys aren't willing to fight, if America said, oh, Soviets got Sputnik, that's cool, we're not going to do anything, bro. Guess what? The Soviets would have won the Cold War. That's obvious. Even though America had better ideas, if we're not willing to fight for them in the West, then how would we win? How would we win?
I do acknowledge that sometimes you have to essentially troll your opponent into making a misstep. So, for example, I am sympathetic to the idea that during the Cold War, there were attempts made to deliberately overhype the level of challenge that the USSR presented so as to motivate politicians to do what needed to actually be done to essentially counter what would have been an eventual Soviet threat that hadn't yet fully emerged.
We need another McCarthyist sort of movement to wake people up to the threat of China.
I wasn't saying it would be McCarthy. I wasn't referring to him because I don't know whether he actually did any positive effects at all. I'm referring to
he did. He actually woke people up to communists within their own country in Hollywood, for example.
I'm talking about what was referred to as, what were they called? I think they were called Team B, which was like the original neoconservatives who were in the defense establishment, who made some outlandish propositions. I'm sure you can agree these are outlandish propositions, that the Soviet Union had like submarines that were capable of being undetected, that could launch nukes from anywhere on planet Earth, and all kinds of things like this.
That was true, though. That was true. They weren't mass produced. But the Delta IV, for example, the Delta III subs, well, they were in small number, just as with their R-7 Semi-Orca rockets were small in number. They did have a 10,000 kilometer plus ballistic missile range, which was enough to put all American cities under their crosshairs. That was true. The difference was the whole bomber gap and missile gap thing. That was wrong. That was a lie. But it wasn't a necessary lie. It was basically to get people to wake up, but it wasn't. Look, when it turned out that, there's a bomber gap. Well, there was a bomber gap. It was in America's favor. They weren't lying when they said that the Soviets have these long-range bombers that can hit you, and the Soviets have these long-range ICBMs that we don't have because they were first to space and everything that we don't have. So we need to invest in it. They weren't wrong. They were just simply mischaracterizing the magnitude of it. But imagine what would have happened if they didn't do that, if they were just honest about it. Would America have spent money? It's kind of like the thing with the Iraq War. People say, Bush didn't frame it from this humanitarian perspective. It's like, would that have sold as well to the American people? Probably not as a security threat. This
is why I'm saying I'm sympathetic to why they did what they did at that time, because they recognized the Soviet Union was a threat to them, and they decided that, okay, they need to motivate people to do something about this thing. And so,
Yeah, they were
there were some mistakes that they made while articulating the point, but the general overall point, it could be understood why they were rationally doing what they were doing at that time. However, the question I'm asking here is that it so happens that this turned out to be okay because they had designated what was actually the correct thing as the threat, which was the Soviet Union in that case.
Okay.
The question I have for you, however, is what if they do this exact same thing with China now, where they have narratives, some of which are not entirely actually correct, and then they end up finding out later they've actually chosen the wrong guy, as in they've chosen the wrong one, and Putin gets away with everything because you guys ended up hyper focusing on China.
Well, no. I want to get tough on Russia. My point around Russia, I think it's a good question. My point around Russia is that they need to be dealt with in the short order. So I've laid out in my videos a 3 to 5 year plan to neutralize them, and that's basically unlimited and rapid drilling of oil in Canada and the US, as well as gas, and exporting it to Europe and selling it at a loss to us, and saying to these companies, look, you're going to do this or you're going to get nationalized, and we are going to take Western Europe off of its dependency on Russia. And additionally to that, because they're global markets, the price will fall so low that the only countries that can even make money are like Saudi Arabia. Russia won't even be able to pay the bills. 66% of their economy comes from, our government budget comes from the export of oil and gas. If they are no longer able to even break even on that, if it's below that for 3 to 4 years, you basically would have what happened to Russia in 2014, except that heat on for 3 to 4 years. Even the most loyal old ladies and men that voted for United Russia and they love Putin because they see him as defending Russia, guess what? They won't get a pension. They're going to come to the Kremlin with their torches and pitchforks, and they'll take out Putin and they'll get a new guy in place. And that will be the point that the West can swoop in and balkanize.
Maybe you would end up with Alexei Navalny in charge instead of the present.
Well, Alexei Navalny, let's be clear about Alexei Navalny right now. Alexei Navalny is not pro-West. He's a Russian nationalist. He thinks that Russia would be a more effective opponent of the West if it got rid of the corruption. And guess what? He's right about it. He'd still be a national security threat, but he would be a different brand than what Putin has. I don't want Navalny to take over Russia. I want Russia to become like Chechnya and Dagestan and Moscow Oblast and so on and so forth. I want to divide them as much as possible and then conquer, basically. That's my approach to it. So I don't want them to I don't want to make the same mistakes of the 90s where we take out the bad guys and then we just abandon and run for the hills and then let them get a new strongman. I don't want that to happen. I want to neutralize that nuclear threat.
Okay. Now, here's the question I've got for you then, which, I mean, you probably saw this coming anyway because I've asked it before in past live streams. So, I mean, you probably anticipated this question fully. But if we go back, since you did invoke the 90s, if we go back to the kind of strategic perspective that emerged during that time period, which is that in order to do that kind of thing to Russia, you'd have to be pitting them against something which is on the opposite side geographically to them. In other words, you would end up in a situation described by people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, for example, where the idea is that you would bolster Europe and pin Russia between the European Union and guess who? China, the very same China that you're trying to undermine. Which then leads to all of these articles that I've seen for years now, for like 2 decades now, of articles being like, you have to pick one. So if you're gonna take Russia down a peg in the way that you're describing, it involves pinning them between the European Union and China strategically to make sure they cannot move.
Yes, but at the same time as we'd be doing this, we'd be blockading China and sanctioning anybody that trades with them. So, like, China would also.
How would you make that a pressure situation for Russia if you're forcing them together? You should be really giving China the inducement to continue to engage in activities which Russians don't like, while simultaneously pressuring them.
No, because China and Russia at this point are both equal threats. One's just a short-term threat and the other's a long-term threat, but they both need to be dealt with. The way that you would enforce this, the way that you would effectively balkanize them is you would fund rebels in every part of the country that are discontented with Moscow, and they would splinter. I mean, Russia is not just the glorious, great Slavic Russian people.
Indeed, there are a lot of ethnic groups.
No, there are like a ton of different ethnic groups, and each of those oblasts has its ethnic characteristics. And you would play a lot of them. Now, I'm not saying it would become 80 different countries, but you get a few different countries out of that, and they would no longer be a collective 8,000 nukes aimed at us. A lot of those nukes would be aimed at each other, and that would be a better status quo, and it would be easier to make the world into the West in the long run. And then as for China, as you mentioned, yeah, would China benefit from this? Yes, except we'd also be hitting hard against China. And I know the next question you'll probably ask is, well, how do you garner the political will to make this happen? I believe that
because how are you going to get them to be okay with you drilling all this oil and exporting it to European Union?
They can't do anything.
To you.
They can't do anything. What are they going to do? Fire their nukes? They would be buried. They know they would lose.
No, I don't mean from outside. I mean getting your own citizens to consent to that. Like you'd have to somehow get Native Americans to consent to this a massive amount of drilling, since a lot of it is on like American
eminent domain.
Just invoke
eminent domain. Just invoke and expand eminent domain for national security reasons. So
you'd also have the people telling you about climate change. You'd have to negotiate with the lobbies.
Climate change is one of the biggest pro-Russian memes that was ever festered in our civilization. So like they literally hype up and support the Green Party. Why does the largest petrol state, the petrol fascist state of Russia, why do they hype up and promote and fund these radical leftist hyper hippie green parties that are against oil? Well, because they're against Western oil production. They don't care if Russia does it. Like, there's a reason Jill Stein had dinner with Putin. The green parties are in bed with the largest producer of oil and gas in the world, which is Russia. And so,
I mean that may be so. And I'm saying that how would you get past that in civil society? Because that would be one of the big sticking points. There was another point as well. There was another one as well that you mentioned where I thought, will liberalism allow you to do that thing?
Well, I wanted to get to that.
Where you threaten nationalization, that was it. A Jeremy Corbyn style move where you're saying, okay, well, if they won't set the price at where we want it, then we want nationalization. Suddenly, you're going to have a massive outcry of neoliberals all banging at your door.
Yes, you're right. There needs to be, I want to be clear here. When I talk about liberalism, I'm not talking about neoliberalism. I want a total and complete repudiation of the neoliberal establishment. I've said this before, I've done many videos on this. My friend Net7, big supporter of my channel here, he's talked about this too. What we need in order to have a really firm and bountiful neoconservative renaissance is we need to get pilled on protectionism. We need to understand that, look, a lot of what Trump did on an economic level was just and it was good. And a lot of people that turned to him out of their being, what would you say, disenfranchised by the neoliberal coastal elites, that was totally true. And their grievances are totally valid, and we will not win. We will not win this thing if we cannot get around a repudiation of the neoliberal status quo, because it's led us from having almost won the world to now being back to basically the situation where we were in the run-up to World War I, except now everybody has nukes. So isn't that wonderful? And then they'll turn to us and say, and the defensive realists will turn to us and say, oh, but if everybody has nukes, then they'll all be scared to attack each other, bro. Because it's not like India and China fought each other recently. It's not like in Russia and China fought each other. I'm so done.
I think that they're oversimplifying.
We need to have a patriotic understanding of economics where we say, look, if corporations are going to be people, that's cool, but people owe their allegiance to the state and corporations owe their allegiance to the state. And yes, you have a fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders to maximize profit, and that's gained us so much in wealth over the centuries that we've had the corporate system. Here's the thing, though. National security trumps your bottom line, and you can have your bottom line, but it's within our system, and you're not allowed to trade with those guys. We need to do that. And you know what it's going to take? It might take somebody like a Trump-type figure who's actually smart and actually understands the issue and actually fights for our side instead of the Russians to come in and say, basically, I wish that we had like a pro-American Trump-type figure who was a neocon. Somebody like a Ronald Reagan that was more centered on, like, basically imagine some of the economics of FDR, but coupled with the patriotism and long-term vision of Ronald Reagan. That would be awesome. So,
I mean, sure, but I mean, you do acknowledge the kind of twists and gyrations that that a person would have to go through. I mean, the only person that I can think of offhand that would be able to pull something like that would be like Lyndon B. Johnson, for example. He might have been able to do that, but only because of the sheer accident of him being a politician who came from a particular region in the US with particular interests.
But Nikki Haley could do it.
How could you possibly reproduce that person again?
Yeah, no. Nikki Haley could do it. She could bring together a coalition of paleocons on the domestic angle and neocons on the foreign policy angle, coupled with a protectionist approach abroad, but a free liberalization approach domestically. That I think that she could be the next Ronald Reagan. I think she would have 8 years that would be formative in bridging the world back towards America and getting away from this liberal internationalist thing where the EU is upset that Israel, they deprived Mohsen Fakhrizadeh of his human rights, bro. They killed a terrorist. How dare they? We're concerned, bro. Like you mentioned the EU and everything. I'm not a fan of the EU. I want to see the EU abolished. I want America to go back to being the dominant player. I'm not a fan of the EU. I'm not a fan of these institutions.
You're really against the third force concept? European Union is a third force, which is that basically the European Union should develop a European army and become a unified nuclear power in its own right.
They've proven themselves to be more sympathetic to Iran than to the Trump administration.
No, that's part of the extension of a strategy that was implemented in the 1990s, though, which was the idea that bear with me here. It's just an extension of a thing that I've said to you before, which is that there's currently an how can you phrase it? An anti-European coalition that exists in the world, right? I'm using big quotations around this because obviously I would not use this kind of phraseology myself, but that's what they had been calling it, where they view China, Iran, and Russia as being anti-them, right? And they say that it is a historical anomaly that all three of these countries would be anti-them at the same time, and that one way to break up this anti-them coalition would be if they were to separate Russia from the other two. This is why they engage in these weird dialogues with Iran. Not because they actually like Iran, but because they believe that by engaging this kind of behavior, they can somehow split Iran from Russia.
Yeah,
so far, it has not actually worked the way that it's supposed to, but it's not because they're not doing it because they're genuinely stupid. It's because it was a strategy they had to try at least once.
No, I disagree. There are strong leaders and there are weak leaders. Angela Merkel and the rest of the Western leaders, I mean, people can make an exception for Macron. Not really. Macron, these whole based Macron memes that you see on Twitter, it's by and large the neoliberal, feckless people that are against war in any circumstance. Look, if we had leaders like Churchill in Europe versus leaders like Merkel, there is a difference. You are imparting way too much five-dimensional chess on the part of the leaders of Western Europe. No. Allow me to make a claim here. They have weak sensibilities. They were never meant for leadership. They're just weak people. And it's not that they like the terrorists and the mullahs in Iran. It's that they genuinely think that this liberal internationalist idea of just talking with them in the world, this internationalist idea that if we all talk and we all have a dialogue that we can avoid war and stuff, bro, they're Neville Chamberlain type people. They're sheep. And we need lions in charge.
It was also supposed to be part of their gas strategy, which was the idea that if you could get Iran on tap, then you could essentially leverage that against the fact that Russia was trying to do gas politics in Europe. So that was a fail. This was outside the context of just like pure liberal internationalism in this case, because they had done like their their class study of like how Iranian society is structured, and they had come to the interesting conclusion. This was one that was even shared by Ben Rhodes, who was in the Obama administration. He came to your camera has died out, by the way. He came to the interesting conclusion that how was I going to phrase this? He came to the interesting conclusion that if you were to put Iran on tap for the oil and gas issue to offset the oil and gas that was coming from Russia, the gas that was coming from Russia, you could actually divide Iranian society, because the people who would develop an interest in trading with the European Union would over time develop natural political differences with their weird mullah counterparts, which would then result in two separate factions in the ruling class emerging. One that is a mercantile class that enjoys trading with the European Union and enjoying the Ferraris, and the other that wants to kind of stylize itself as being aesthetics who are completely divorced from any kind of commercialism, and that these two factions might eventually fight each other while we eat popcorn. That was what they actually thought. It didn't turn out that way for a variety of reasons, but even though I'm deeply critical of things that have gone on in Europe over time, I would say that on that one, I can understand why they thought that was an interesting strategy.
Okay, Ray, I did miss a little bit of that because my internet cut out, but I wanted to say, though, on the point that you're getting at here, it reminds me a lot of the neoliberals that thought that if we just trade with communist China, that we can get them to liberalize economically, but then they'll also liberalize politically. And we should have learned our lesson from that's a really dumb idea. It turns out when you give a brutal thug regime a ton of money, they just use that to bolster their security state. Like that's what always happens.
I think the US also, well, the US specifically, because I mean the European Union could have done something too, but I mean the US was more like in the driver's seat at this time, or at least was in a better position to have acted during that Green Uprising thing, where they had these individuals who were on the ground in Iran who came out after. The plan was playing out fair, if you could call it a plan, because again, it's one of those things where there's so many moving parts that sometimes you don't want to act as though everything was like foreseen from on high or whatever. But as it turned out, with the money flowing into Iran, the human beings on the ground were not seeing it translating into their pockets. So the division was in fact there, because people were thinking, well, if they've got a deal and if they've got these interactions between the dreaded West and Iran going on, why is it that none of that is reflecting in wealth in terms of like what the working people in Iran were receiving? It's because obviously the rulers were pocketing it into their own back pockets and everyone could see it happening, which then resulted in obviously an uprising, a little bit of mini revolt was happening from below as a consequence. For some reason, during the Obama administration, he decided to actually skip out on actually assisting them when the time came. So they missed their chance.
No, but that's because Obama was weak. Obama was weak.
So I would say it's not that the strategy itself was wrong. It's just that when the time came to actually do the thing that was supposed to be done, suddenly they didn't do anything.
Okay, well, yeah, but that, I guess, we should probably wrap up the debate pretty soon. What I think is really one of the fundamental differences between us here is that we both kind of agree on a number of weaknesses and drawbacks to what the West has been doing in a lot of these cases. But the difference is I'm here trying to outlay, in all my videos, I do 2 videos a day on this channel now. What I'm trying to do is change the culture so that we can get back to a point where we are strengthening the West and we aren't making these mistakes anymore. Whereas what I see you bringing up is you bring up these mistakes and these areas of fecklessness and weakness, and you say, therefore, we're going to write off the West, and you call yourself an anti-liberal. I look at this and I say we need to have liberals that are mugged by reality, that are going to come in and essentially not make the same mistakes that we made before. But I don't want to throw out the Western project. I want to safeguard it. I want to strengthen it. And whereas for people such as yourself, and I'm not saying you're alt-right here, but people on the alt-right do this too. They look at the weakness in the West and they say, well, I want no part in that. I'm going to go and side with, for them, it's Russia. For you here, it's this sort of pan-Asianist approach, or like I've seen you make apologetics for the CCP, particularly on the virus. But that's kind of, we got into a bit about that earlier, but that's the thing. Why not try to strengthen the West? Why? But again, I think that goes back to a fundamental difference in opinion too, which I don't really think that a debate would solve this, which is that what I gathered is that you don't believe that the Western Enlightenment is the steady state of humanity that we should be aiming for, is what I understand. So,
I'm saying that, I'd be saying that if Northwestern Europe and the United States are okay with having the Enlightenment be the centerpiece of the way that they interpret the world, I wouldn't tell them that they're not allowed to do that. At the same time, however, I bring a what's the word for it? It's not skepticism, but it's more like a kind of knowing the limitations. So I would then not say that I would expect this could be exported to the entirety of the planet in a uniform way.
But so then that misses the point of the Enlightenment.
With a different bar of expectation from the start.
But that misses the whole point of the Enlightenment, which is that all humans, not just white Europeans, have this dignity and autonomy and the right to the freedoms that we have here. And you're making this relativist argument of saying, well, how do we know our culture is better than theirs? It's like, no, some cultures are better than others.
The thing is, I'm not saying that people, obviously I would never say that people who don't have the Western Enlightenment at the center point of their political understanding aren't believing in dignity or autonomy, because you could arrive at positions of dignity or autonomy via some perhaps alternate method, right? The fact that everyone has put their signature against
a Sharia law understanding. I had literal self-identified feminists in my university try to tell me that the literal burqa or the niqab were feminists because they give women because they give women. You don't understand, in that culture, women are so prized that only the husband is even allowed to see her. That's how feminist they are. That kind of bullshit to me.
No, I wouldn't say no. Obviously, I would not say that, because obviously they are obviously violating the fundamental rights of people when they do that.
So you agree our culture is better then?
what I'm saying is that somehow people were able to come and put their signature against the basic principles of the UN Charter, for example, which affirm dignity and so on and so forth. Some people, when they did this, they were lying, of course. We know, right?
Yeah.
But I'm saying it is not entirely impossible that someone can arrive at those conclusions from a different perspective and have it be actually true.
But
So,
they
like,
haven't. They haven't. Nowhere in the world has that been a thing. So.
I mean, well, this may be the root of the disagreement then, because while we agree that obviously something like
You're
Sharia
having a
law is
little
not
bit of an
capable of
echo.
delivering dignity, I'm sure that there are other conceptions
who?
or other cultural. Say again.
I was saying, Ray, you're having a little bit of an echo coming through. It's not super noticeable, so you probably work. I don't know if you have the stream going through.
No, I don't.
It wasn't a problem before. I just noticed it. But
is it gone now?
I think so. It's not a super big deal. You can work
it may have been just a one-off.
We should probably wrap up the stream like pretty soon.
Well, Ray was saying, so I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just saying.
Yeah, I was saying that I just have a different bar for what the goal should be. Like, from my perspective, I'm okay if everyone has basic dignity and everyone's humanity is basically recognized, and human rights that everyone has agreed to are not violated. I don't necessarily mind like what angle they manage to find their way to that position from, unless that angle is one that is so egregious that it is obviously ridiculous. So, for example, when you have something like a feudal ideology such as Islamic fundamentalism, you know from the start that they're never going to arrive at a position that is actually edifying to humanity, right? However, that does not apply to everything that is not Western. It is possible for non-Western groups or people who do not have the Enlightenment at the center of their viewpoint to still arrive at positions that fundamentally affirm human flourishing.
Okay, and in the rest of the areas where they have that blind spot, they should be pressured and leveraged into moving in sync with the Enlightenment. So,
yeah, I think Kevin was saying we need to wrap up, which I think is true. We're coming up on 3 hours almost.
Yeah,
I don't know if you needed a break before closing statements, or if you even. Yeah, I guess you still would want to do.
No, I think we should have an intermission, and then we should go to say 3 or 5 minute closing statements.
Okay, yeah, if you need 5 minutes.
I'll be back in a minute then.
Okay, looks like Kevin's back. I don't know about Ray, maybe.
Yep.
All right, cool. So did you guys? You want to go to closing statements? It's over 3 hours. It kind of would make sense, I suppose.
Yeah, no, Ray can go first if you want. So.
Okay, well, I mean, I think it's been a pretty good conversation that we've had. It's been less hostile than it was actually billed as. I mean, there are some things that we agree on, that we overlap on, which is obviously we agree or we seem to agree that forms of backward reactionary feudal ideology, particularly Islamic fundamentalism and so on, these things are obviously not good for human development in general, not good for economic development, not good for human flourishing in general. It's just that we seem to disagree on what methods may be permissible in order to fight these things, or at least a strategy behind how this stuff can be mitigated and what would be required in order to create a peaceful, balanced looking world. So, I mean, Kevin seems to be of the opinion that one way to overcome the mistakes made previously in the past would be to just have one system cover everything, in which case then there would be no disagreement between anyone because everyone would believe the same thing. Whereas I have a more restricted view, which is that I don't believe it's possible to get everyone to reach that point of agreement, nor do I think it's desirable necessarily to have everyone reach that exact point of agreement, because some cultures do not believe certain things because they don't have the same historical building blocks from which to understand the world from that perspective. So it would be almost like, from my perspective, it would be almost like you're trying to make people believe things that they would not be equipped to believe. Another thing that I would say, I guess, I don't want to make my ending statement like super duper long, because I don't want to sort of rehash things that we've already been through, although I'm sure Kevin will be able to respond to me anyway. I sometimes think that mirror imaging is what liberalism has been unfortunately engaged in. When I say liberalism, I mean the broadest sense here. The Western world in general engages in something quite harmful, which is mirror imaging, where they imagine what's the antithesis of their own belief system would be, and then they attribute to their opponent motives which would be associated with that, which then leads to characterizing one's opponents as cartoon villains. So, for example, they would believe that their opponent is continually planning to do harm, which I think is perhaps sometimes too dramatic. I view that some of these hostile governments, particularly the one in the People's Republic of China, for example, or the Republic of Vietnam, etc. I mean, I see these things as being sometimes a government is just a government. It keeps people fed and clothed day after day, year after year, in many different provinces. People are living their lives under the rule of these governments without seeing a policeman and without hearing the scream of any jet fighters overhead, for example. And we need to take into account that many of these people in these countries may in fact think that they're just living in a totally normal universe, right? And that nothing is too amiss here. And so when we see Western countries talking about intervention or overthrow and so on, I think people need to be very focused in when and where they choose to apply this pressure, because sometimes they may enter a situation thinking they're about to be greeted with flowers, only to find that everyone's actually really mad with them for what they've just done. So, I mean, I'm not going to go on for too long, but I'm saying that there needs to be more nuance in this situation, and it would be really nice, I think, if liberalism were to bring a little bit more nuance to the situation. And I'll sort of draw a line under it there and let Kevin give his closing statement.
All right, cool. Yeah, it's about 3 minutes. I think Kevin said 3 to 5, so I think there's no need to have like a hard time on these. But
okay,
if you want to go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, well, I was just going to make my closing statement, kind of independent of the points that Ray was making, because we can't go on like 6 hours or anything. But do kind of want to just follow that up a little bit there, just to point out to my friends here that are viewing here tonight, and to everybody here tonight. It did appear normal. It was kind of normal to a lot of people in Imperial Japan, or to people in Germany, that, oh, this is just the system now, and this is our government, and Hitler, he provides the roads and the work, and we build the roads and we get our bread and stuff. And a lot of, German folks, a lot of, great Aryan men and women and their children, they never saw any cops or anything, because like they weren't Jewish or anything. They weren't seen as degenerates, bro. So like, is a dictatorship really that bad? Is it really that bad? I mean, it's just their culture, bro. So that's kind of my rebuttal there to that point that Ray was making. But to get to kind of the broader closing statements here that I really intend tonight, is that I think I've made the case here very well that, well, the liberal order has had some drawbacks and some missteps and some mistakes. We can weed out those problems, and we can bolster ourselves, and we can work out the kinks, and we can go forward unified with the conviction that we know that we are the vanguard of liberty, and that, make no mistake, my friends, there is good and evil in the world. And it is not sufficient to say, well, maybe those people in North Korea, they never really saw like a police officer. Yeah, not yet. And just because the secret police haven't come to your apartment yet to take you off to the gulag doesn't mean that you should stand for it, that they've done that to your neighbor. And that complacency, that absolute lack of resolve to say, look, we like democracy here, but democracy over there, maybe they can have like their dictatorship and stuff. Now, once we do that and we accept that as the long run status quo, we will inevitably, mark my words, we will inevitably succumb to the degeneracy of our own moral relativism, such that when literal fascism emerges here, we'll say, well, can we really even oppose it? Maybe we were the bad guys. Maybe the West is the bad guys, bro. Maybe we should be like Putin and have that kind of system, bro. So no, I think that it's very clear. Good and evil are real. And we, as the good guys, we should rest assured that we are good. We shouldn't question ourselves and say, oh, we're the bad guys, bro. But by the same token, we shouldn't then just be secure in this delusion that we're going to inevitably win. No. Unless we fight like our lives depend on it for the world, we will lose the world and we will be buried. And I would rather bury the enemy. And in that regard, we're going to have to do some things that might seem contradictory, that might seem a little illiberal here or there. But if we are not willing to make the slightest of compromises in order to secure our continuity into posterity, we will be buried. Mark my words, my friends. We have to galvanize ourselves here as the West and say it's not just that we're taking our civilization back from moral relativism and this fecklessness. It's that we are going to forge the world into our illustrious image. And you can oppose us all you want, but that doesn't mean that you're right. And those who disagree, well, they will be dealt with. So that is my view. And thank you for coming here and watching this debate tonight, my friends. And, and thanks to Ray for coming on, and thanks to Henry for moderating. I thought it was much more of a civil conversation than I was expecting as well. So thanks.
All right. Yeah, I thought it was great. That was about 3 minutes, 30 seconds or so. So pretty even on the closings there. Yeah, I thought it was great too, man. I guess, I don't know how to, how we should do that. I guess everyone have a Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, all that stuff. Yeah, that was a good debate. Yeah. So thanks for coming, everybody.
Absolutely. Right, thanks for being here. Thanks for being here. I will, just a quick plug, I will be doing a stream in about 30 minutes if people want to watch that. I don't know, Ray, are you going to be streaming tonight?
No, I probably will watch yours.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah.
She'll troll your chat.
Troll the chat. That's right. Well, no, I'm not.
Obviously, I will not troll your chat. I don't do trolling.
Yeah, no. I'm just going to be doing
for the dislike on there.
Yeah, no, I'm just going to be doing.
I'm seeing that in your chat, like some people came in and were saying some like irresponsible things or whatever. But I assume your moderators dealt with it.
Oh yeah, I haven't actually checked the chat.
Yeah, any trolling that went on in the chat, obviously I do not endorse it, and I don't think any of my followers are in there doing any trolling, but they should not if they had been.
Yeah, no, I don't read chat during debates just so that people know. That's the best advice I was ever given. So I just focus on the debate at hand. So.
Okay,
yeah, I was kind of skipping it.
But just know that if you do find any trolls in there, I did not instruct anyone to do any trolling, and I don't think I see any of my followers doing trolling. So if there is someone doing bad stuff, I had nothing to do with that.
I think Kevin gets plenty of trolls when you're not around.
Normal. That's not like a Ray thing. That's just anytime I go on here, people call me a Jew or whatever. I'm not sure what they've been saying tonight. It's just I'm sure there was probably some stuff.
I don't think they were calling you a Jew. I was kind of looking at it. They weren't talking about your ears either. So
wait, there were no ears accusations? No, I thought it was one of the weird ones.
Yeah, I know.
My USS Liberalism.
So it seems the trolls actually decided to take somewhat of a day off with my presence here. I should call it more often.
Yeah, it wasn't that bad. There was a lot of people arguing with each other in the chat. Mostly is what I saw.
Was Reese here? Where's Reese?
Oh yeah, Reese was there. He was arguing with people in
the chat the whole time, as far as I could see.
Oh,
well, he wasn't there. He came in about the middle and was arguing with people.
Oh man, that's pretty funny. We were talking about Greece the other day, the country on the show, and somebody's like, I think it was Zaus, was like, "Where's Greece?" You know, because that's like a big meme now with Reese, right? Where's Reese? But Reese is here.
Anyway, I guess we gotta end the stream sometime.
Yeah, we should probably end this up. But yeah, no, I thought it was more cordial, and we should do this again sometimes. I do debates and stuff on this channel, so you know.
Okay.
All right.
Have a good evening, everybody.